Great. There we go. So let's just take a moment, and we'll be starting in a few minutes. So just sit back and relax, and I look forward to hearing from you very soon. So we will be speaking about before midnight during this live stream. So just hold on tight, and we will be doing this in a few minutes. So let's see. Excuse me. So Hulkeract is here. Hello. And in Thailand. So hello. It's nice to see you. And Galaxy Tides is here as well. Hello. It's nice to see you again. So and I hope you're well, my friend. And so today we will be talking about the film Before Midnight, 2013 film. This is Richard Linklater's film starring Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke. So this is the third film in this series of films that we have been talking about over the past month or so, on and off, of course. But this is the third, and as of now, the last, although I should put that in air quotes, last film in this cycle of films, starting whose titles each begin with the word before, and then it's a play on the word before, and then now we have Before Midnight. And I'll also hopefully be talking a little bit about the significance of these titles during the course of this live stream. But these are just a little bit of a heads up, but we won't be starting until give it another 3 minutes or so, and we'll go from there. So it's now 10:56 by my clock. Oh, Paco Silva is here. Hello, my friend. How are you? I hope you're well. And by the way, could you please let me know if the sound and image quality, the video quality, is okay? And if so, Razor Wire Reviews is here. Hello, Luke. You say, I'm ready for the After trilogy. Interesting. Flippin' Distical Pictures. What up from London? Hello. And so Paco, you say, I watched this film 2 times this morning. One with the commentary on. Yes, the commentary track with Linklater and Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke, right? Yeah, that's a really great commentary track. They actually talk about a lot of things that are pretty revelatory, I think. And I'll try to address some of those revelations in the course of this live stream. I'll try to, but maybe you have a better grasp of what they said. So if I miss out on anything, Paco, you just come in at any time and feel free to correct me or to add more information. But let's see. So yeah, we'll be starting in a few minutes. We haven't started yet, but we will be talking about the film Before Midnight, and we'll be starting in a few minutes. So just wanted to just check if the sound is okay? Is the sound okay? And also, is the video quality, is the image coming through okay? I can never tell with these live streams, so I just want to hopefully the sound and the image quality is okay. And yeah, let's see. Okay. So again, we'll be beginning in a couple minutes, so just hold on tight. Oh, Paco says, oh, thank you very much. So you've confirmed the sound and video are very good, so I'm glad to hear that. And Razor Wire Review says, great. It's good to see you, my friend. Very, very good to see you. And remember, the offer still holds about what we spoke about you know what and you know what. So let me know if you want to do that, my friend. Let's see. Oh, and I just want to say Raymond Rodriguez is here. Hello. And David Recca is here. Hello. Raymond Rodriguez says, good evening, my friend. This film is probably my favorite of the 3, but they are all great. Yes. I will be planning on talking about all 3 of them because it's very difficult for me to speak about this film Before Midnight and not make any reference to the earlier films Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. And so I'll do my best to try to talk about each of the films in relation to Before Midnight, with a particular focus on Before Midnight, of course. David Recca is here. Hi, Daisuke. This was a difficult film, yes, but well worth it. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Excellent. Excellent. Yes, it is a very difficult film. Mike Eli is here. Hello. Whoops. Let's see here. Sorry about that. And Mike Eli is here. Hello. Daniel Valdez is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. And we'll be starting momentarily. Just give it another minute or so. And Daniel, you said, I love this film in the series. Yes, yes, it is a great one. There's a lot here. And I think there's a lot here that we all, in some way or another, can relate to. In terms of the way in which we deal with relationships, and the way we look at ourselves, and the way we try to capture the moment or seize the moment and recall things of the past. And Gloin de Hobbit says, hey Daisuke, I didn't like the last film in the trilogy. Too much snipping. So referring to the fighting, perhaps, and I will get to that as well. Yes, I understand your comment here. And so that's wonderful. So we will talk about some maybe various approaches. And so there's no reason to have to love this film. It's very healthy and very important to express critical views of films, including this one. So please feel free to do so at any time, and I'm always happy to listen, my friend. And that goes for all of you going forward, including this film. But with that in mind, my friends, let us get started. Mr. Liam is here. Hello. It's nice to see you, as always. And let's see. With that, my friends, let us get started. Excuse me. So, greetings from Tokyo, my friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are doing very, very well, or as well as can be expected. And I really, that is something I really mean, and it's. I'm very fortunate to have been able to meet a number of people through this YouTube channel, but it's always difficult to know how everyone is doing, because it's very hard to know exactly what everyone's situation is. And so whatever the situation is for you, my friends, at this particular time, I just hope that things are well, or as well as they can be. And you can always come here at any time, and it'll be my pleasure to see you and talk with you, and to listen to what it is you have to say about cinema, about life. And I know always that I have much to learn from you, and I always value your support and friendship, and you're always continuing to inspire me. So my dear friends, I hope you are well, or as well as can be expected. And with that, today the item on the agenda, as it were, is this film, which I have here, the Criterion release of this, which is Before Midnight, the Richard Linklater film from 2013, starring Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke. And this is, of course, a continuation of what is now deemed to be a trilogy, although I prefer to call it a cycle of films, beginning with the film Before Sunrise, and then continuing on with the film Before Sunset, and then now we have Before Midnight. And so today, and of course we spoke about Before Sunrise several weeks ago, and then subsequently to that we spoke about Before Sunset, and now we will be talking about Before Midnight. And let me just get the preliminary comments set forth first, which is that, so this is going to be a live stream discussion of this film, and so the live chat is open. And so please feel free to discuss this film, and please just share your thoughts with us, with me. And I welcome people who like this film and enjoy this film for what it is. I also welcome people who didn't necessarily like it as well. And your opinions are are very valuable to me, the positive and the negative ones. And so please feel free to express your opinions on this film, and I'm always happy to listen to them. So so the live chat is there, and please, we have always shown a mutual respect for each other's opinions, even where we have disagreed. We have always shown this mutual respect, and you've always been shown me so much respect and courtesy and kindness. And I've always done my best to extend to you, the same or similar degree of kindness to the extent that I'm able to. Sometimes I'm unable to, of course, because of my own shortcomings. I'm always trying to improve, of course. But the point I want to bring up is that please, I always rely upon you to extend not just to me but to everyone here that same sense of mutual courtesy and respect. You've done that for me so many times in the past, and I've always been so grateful, and I've relied on you on many, many occasions. And so I know and trust that spirit will continue in the live chat. So thank you very much in advance for always looking out for me and looking out for each other. I really appreciate that. And so I look forward to the live chat discussions. And I should say also that the discussion today will be talking about specific details of this film, Before Midnight. And so if you haven't seen Before Midnight, then I strongly, strongly suggest that you turn off this live stream right now, because I don't want to spoil this film for you. Please, this will be uploaded into as a video, and this will be uploaded as a video after it's over, so you can always come back to this channel and watch this as a video afterwards. And I will be very happy to listen to what it is you have to say in a comment if you wanted to talk further about it with me. I'm very happy to hear your thoughts about it. But the point is, today I will be speaking about specifics and spoilers about this film. So please, if you haven't seen it, just please know that before going any further. And again, you can always come back at any time. And I should say that I also will be talking specifically about Before Sunset and Before Sunrise. This film, at least my attempt at discussing Before Midnight, it is inevitable that comparisons and references will be made to these earlier films. They must be made to these earlier films. It is my personal belief that this film, it operates on its own merits. Of course it does, but it also operates, I think, quite fundamentally on an understanding of the earlier two films. And I think it's from my point of view anyway, a discussion on this film needs to include references to the earlier films. And so if you haven't seen these earlier films either, then I actually even more strongly suggest that you turn off this live stream, because I will be making references to the earlier films as well, and that includes spoilers for these earlier films. And so because, as I say, this will be a kind of discussion of this film, but as I say, inherent in a discussion of Before Midnight is references made to these earlier films. And so it's almost like a comparison to the earlier films, or it's almost like trying to see how the entire world or worlds are integrated with each other. And so therefore these two films are, I think, quite crucial and essential from my point of view. So I also will be talking about these. So if for whatever reason you haven't seen these two films either, then please, you can turn off this live stream and watch these films and Before Midnight, and then you can come back at any time. And so I'll be very happy once again to hear your thoughts about these films at that time. And I should also say that, as with everything, I don't claim to be any kind of expert on this film or on the earlier films. I only come at this as a viewer and as a fan of these works, and someone who has kind of grown up along with the characters, starting from 1994, 1995, and then 9 years later, 9 years later, of course. And so I've felt like I've kind of been growing up. So I've seen these films a number of times, and so I'm approaching this discussion as someone who has seen these films. I don't claim to be an expert. I haven't academically studied them. I don't have any links to the production, so I don't know the ins and outs of the details, etc. But I do know what I know merely based on my own experience as a viewer. And so if you're looking for questions, if you have any questions about this film, it's very possible that I won't necessarily be able to answer all of your questions to your satisfaction, and I will certainly do my best, but there might be things that I won't be able to answer, so I just ask for your understanding in advance. And also, speaking of which, I should say also that I will be doing my best to keep up with the live chat and address all of you. If for whatever reason I skip your comment, I apologize in advance. That wasn't my intention. Again, I'm just doing my very best here, keeping up with the live chat, but it is just only me, so in terms of checking the live chat and running it. And so and I'm speaking at the same time as well, so please understand if I accidentally unintentionally skip over your comment. It's not my intention. However, based on that, I should say one thing, which is that if you have a question for me that is not related to Before Midnight, then I will, with great respect, just very gently skip over it, because I don't want to focus on anything other than this film and these films for purposes of this live stream. If you want to ask me the same question afterwards, maybe in a separate video, I hope I've always tried to make the effort to answer all of the comments. And so if you have any question you want to ask me or make a comment to me, please feel free to do so in the comment section here or in any other video, and I will certainly address it to the best of my ability. So with that, let's see. With that, my friends, let me now start the ball rolling, as it were, by I guess that could be maybe a reference to rolling the boulder up the hill, which is what Celine says early on in this film in the car ride, where she's talking about her disappointment with the turbine project that didn't go through, and this is part of her feeling that she maybe wants to change her job, work for the government again with someone named Remy, and this forms part of or one of the cruxes, if you will, or one of the critical points that brings this situation to a boil. And really, it creates a kind of a very venomous interaction between these two, and something that we haven't seen before in these films. But I should say that hold on, here we go. I should say that the so what was I saying? So the boulder and the just getting things started. I think that this film is a very complex work. And it was one that when it was released or when it was announced, I was very surprised, actually. I was looking forward to it, but I was also very surprised because I was kind of not expecting a third film. I was more or less almost okay with the end of Before Sunset and how that ended, and it was a very ambiguous ending, as you know. And so I was very much I was very much almost hesitant to know what happened. There's almost a beauty in not knowing what happened with Celine and Jesse at the end of before sunset, right? But at the same time, I was also very eager and curious, as was, I'm sure, a lot of other people at the time. I was very eager and curious to know what indeed happened. And so I, like many other people, went to see this film with great anticipation, and I was very excited, and I was looking forward to it immensely, having seen the other two films many, many times. And I think that the end result for me, when I first saw the film before midnight, was something of a mixed feeling. I was very confused about this film when I first saw it. I admit that. And I think the source of my confusion when I first saw this film, again, when it was initially released, came from the fact that this was something that we had never seen before, I would suggest. Sure, there are moments, there are many, many moments, in fact, that I would suggest are things that are very closely linked to Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. There are so many close linkages with these earlier films, so many that we begin to realize that there is much more connectivity within the realm of these universes that are being created than perhaps one might have anticipated upon watching the first film or the second film. Okay, so there are links made to the earlier films. There are also stylistic similarities in that the idea of Jesse and Celine walking. This time they're in, and they're in maybe a different place in the world. You know, first it was Vienna, then it was Paris, and now we're in Greece. And so there is this idea of walking, and there is this idea of talking with each other. So walking and talking, and also there is this idea of talking about maybe relationships or memory or time or one's lives and what one wants to do with one's life, and the relationships between people and couples, sort of and also I think more generally masculine ways of thinking and feminine ways of thinking, differences between men and women, similarities between men and women, and growing old, youth and aging, and also belief systems, belief in God, belief in something other than God, perhaps, and also moments of intimacy and moments of correction and moments of connection and connectivity. So all these things do emerge in Before Midnight, as they did in Before Sunrise and even earlier in Before Sunset. And so this is to say that on the one hand, yes, there are many aspects of Before Midnight that have a clear connection with the earlier films, similarities, of course. So this makes it a real purely essential before film, right? But at the same time, there are also many differences that make Before Midnight a starkly independent, different chapter, if you will, of these three films. And I think it is the existence of these differences, some more striking to me than others. These differences really helped, or not helped, but they really affected my initial viewing of this, such that I felt very confused. And I felt like it was really sort of a kind of strong, impactful experience that I had, but it was also a very confusing one for a number of reasons in terms of its structure, etc. But then a little bit of time passed, and I began to re-watch it and watch it again more in the context of the film as it exists on its own, but also as it exists in the trilogy. And the Criterion box set came out as well, and so that helped me along even more. And so now I realize that the things that I was reacting to upon initial viewing, and I'll try to be as specific as I can as we get along into this live stream, but the things that I was reacting to upon initial viewing were, in fact, things that I now recognize as being essential to the whole structure of this film, and thus, more broadly, essential to the entire structure of the three films, the cycle of films. And so everything that I saw as confusing to me upon initial view, I now see as being crucial, and thus creating more illumination and helping me to get a better appreciation for what I think is going on here in Before Midnight, and more broadly what is going on in the films that we've seen thus far. And so now I see this film as being truly an essential next step from the earlier two films that we saw. The tone is different, of course, and it is a different trajectory in terms of where we see the characters going. They are, of course, in different situations as well. But they were in different situations in the earlier two films, and they were having different trajectories as well. We don't, but those differences I will try to address with more specificity and more detail as we go along. But this, as my opening salvo, if you will, is my way of saying that this is a film that really grew on me, and because it's a very rough film. It's a very painful film to watch, and because of the pain and the rawness of it and the real almost seething anger that these characters seem to have towards one another, even to the point where and the kinds of manipulations and indirect attacks that we see these characters display with each other and against each other. A lot of it can be quite sad and very difficult to watch this film. But taking a step back, I think that feeling of sadness and that feeling of difficulty is very crucial to an understanding of not only this film but also the other two films and how they operate in this universe. And so I think, therefore, this is a key film, and it's one that is it's not only inevitable, but it's also essential to the works. And so with that, it is my great pleasure to be able to share with you going forward just some specifics about why it is I feel that way. And more importantly to me, of course, I will be very happy to hear your thoughts about this and how you feel about it. Again, I'm very happy also to hear critical thoughts about this film as well, because, as I say, I was there. I felt the same or similar types of critical feelings against this film when I first saw it. So I'd be very happy to hear those opinions as well going forward. But before I go any further, let me now take the opportunity just to go through the live chat, and then we will go from there. So let's see. Raymond says, Raymond Rodriguez, hello, you said good evening. Yes, so I saw this comment before, right? So film is probably my favorite of the three, but they're all great. And then David Recca, you said later, this was a difficult film. And so I understand what you're saying, because I too felt a certain sense of it being difficult. And let's see, and then Gloin de Hobbit, you echo something similar. You say, I didn't like the last film. Too much snippings, too much arguing. Yes, but I think the arguments, the seeds of arguments, I would suggest, were being sown from the very beginning, from the early film Before Sunrise, and then further Before Sunset. That's not to say that those two films were also at the same level of arguing that we see in Before Midnight. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But we do see seeds of the arguments that they have in Before Midnight planted in the earlier films, and I'll try to get to that as well. Mr. Liam says, I like the first and second best, though. But you also said earlier, what a great film. Yes. Rourke Productions, greetings from DC. All is well on my end. It's good to hear, my friend. And let's see, Raymond continues, then again, my friend, it's very hard to put these films in an order. They are all great. Probably Before Sunset is my favorite. I forgot you were doing Before Midnight today. David Acosta's here. Hello. Andrew, hello, my friend. I wasn't expecting to like this one as much as I did. I thought Sunrise was good, Sunset was perfect, and Midnight was on the same level as Sunset for me. Wow, that's wonderful. And let's see, Gloin Dahabit said, Daisuke, if I was in Jesse's shoes, I would have stayed with my first wife and end the cycle of divorce that plagued his family. Yes, I'll get to that in a moment as well, but you're referring to the fact that in this film, we realize that in Before Sunset, of course, Jesse was married, and not only was he married, he had a child, a son named Henry or Hank, and so he was married when he came, and he's on his book tour, and the final stop in Before Sunset was, of course, Paris, and that's where he caught up with Celine once again after not seeing her for 9 years. And they had their discussions and walk through the streets of Paris, and that forms the basis of that film, as you know. And what you're referring to is the fact that he was married in that film. Well, now in Before Midnight, we understand, therefore, that since then, or at that time, they had gotten together, and not only had they gotten together that particular day, but the consequences of their reunion after the end, immediately after the end of Before Sunset, we can assume include, for example, Jesse divorcing his wife, and there had been some kind of a very difficult custody battle or divorce involving custody claims on both sides with respect to their son, Hank. And along the way, Celine and Jesse, they were living in New York for a little bit, but Celine then became pregnant, and she wanted to move back to Paris to be close to her mother. And so Jesse also agreed to that. And also in that time, the relationship between Celine and Jesse's ex-wife, Celine calls her his wife, but he corrects her, right? Ex-wife, right? And so the relationship between Jesse's ex-wife and Celine doesn't seem to be very good. In fact, it seems to be very, very antagonistic. And we see Celine in this film, Before Midnight, make some pretty sort of almost, as I say, very heated comments towards the wife, the ex-wife. There it was that I did it too, and so this is part of this. What one might consider the strain or stress that is part of Jesse's current life right now. The point of it is that Jesse and Celine live in Paris, and they have 2 children of their own, twins, and we see those twins here in this film Before Midnight. And Hank is in the custody of Jesse's ex-wife in Chicago. And so that means that Jesse and his son don't see each other, or they don't spend every day with each other, because Jesse is living in Paris and his son Hank is in Chicago. And so they can only see each other on certain times of the year. And unfortunately, the relationship between Jesse's ex-wife and Jesse and Celine is such that it's probably not going to be a harmonious thing for the ex-wife to agree to have Hank be in the custody of Jesse. And so this creates a kind of rift, or not a rift yet, but it creates kind of tension that we see at the very start of the film, which I'll get to in a moment in the airport. And then therein lies the development of the film as we as viewers are trying to catch up with all the events. And so Gloin to Hobbit, you say, if I was in Jesse's shoes, I would have stayed with my first wife and end the cycle of divorce that plagued his family. And you say his family because we understand also that in Before Sunrise, we remember that when Celine and Jesse were walking in Vienna, and I think specifically in the Prater Park, after they were on the Ferris wheel, and they're walking through the sort of the amusement park area. Jesse is talking about how his parents did not get along, and they eventually divorced, but they stayed together as long as they could for the benefit of what did he say? He stayed together. They stayed together for the benefit of his sister and I. That's what he says, and it's interesting his use of prepositional objects, which I'll get to later in the film because there is a link with that. But the point I want to make is that he does explain in Before Sunrise that his parents also divorced, and I think going to Hobbit, therefore you are making the reference to the fact that his parents divorced and now Jesse is divorced, but you would have liked to have seen maybe Jesse stay with his now ex-wife and break the chain of divorce. I don't know if I'm describing that correctly, but I understand what you're saying, and so yes, there is that, but as we see in this film, this is a kind of echoing or repeating of events or actions or actions, excuse me, that have existed in the past. And sometimes those actions can be repeated without necessarily us realizing it or knowing it. And I think we see this not only in the little minute actions or minutia of things or words or phrases that are oft repeated in this film, but that are echoes from the previous two films, but also in terms, I think, of what Going to Hobbit is referring to, the cycle of things, and how, I think it's Celine who says at the end of during the fight in the hotel room, she says, let me see, I just want to get the let's see, I want to get the exact comment here. It's talking about parents. And yes, Celine says, we all get dragged through our parents' lives. She says that in the hotel fight. And I think that's really apt because that is really speaking to what Going to Hobbit is talking about, in that there is a kind of cyclical nature of existence that is being reflected here. And it's being made even more emphasized by Celine's line there, right? We all get dragged through our parents' lives. In the context, she's talking about Hank. And he is talking about his concerns about Hank, and he wants to have a more consistent place in his life. That's what he's saying. But she is resisting that, and she's also referring to the mess that is currently had between Jesse's ex-wife and Celine, and Jesse on the other side. And so Hank seems to be caught up in the middle, and so that's what she's referring to. But it's also an echo of what you're referring to, Going to Hobbit, which is things are cyclical, and they seem to be, one way that they seem to be cyclical is through our existences as we relate them vis-a-vis our parents. And so I think this line, we all get dragged through our parents' lives, is actually directly related to what you're saying, and this notion of the cyclical nature of life, not just in terms of our own existences, but generationally as well. So it's a very great comment, but I will try to get to a little bit more of that particular scene in the hotel scene a little bit later, because that is, as you know, one of the crucial scenes of this film. But that's a great comment, Going to Hobbit. Yes. Bry Guy 2000 says, I did got this trilogy of the collection since I didn't attend the previous two streams. I say Sunset is one of the best romance films I've seen. Sunrise was good. Yes. Gung Fu, hello. Will you also do a compare of the three movies and how well the story plays through? I love the first movie, but forgot what part two was about, and remember some of the third, which to me was the weakest. Yes, as I said, I'll try to make some connections along the way between this film, or among this film and the other two films. So, Flippin' Distical Pictures, this film is radically brilliant. And Gung Fu says, but as always, I might change my mind when I hear your thoughts about this third film. And let's see. And then Paco says, I'm very into the subgenre I call breakup films. And there's also discussion here about, okay, so let me now talk, I will get to the live chat a little bit later, but now let me just go into a little bit of detail about this work. And I think a place that we can start is the beginning of this film. And already before the title emerges on the screen, and as you recall, the title Before Midnight emerges as the car is driving along the road, and so that is also something that we'll be talking about. But before that, we open, or the film opens, where? In a very peculiar place. It's a place that we haven't necessarily seen before, and that's an airport. And this is an airport we later discover is in Greece. Now, this is we understand it's now Kalamata Airport in Greece, and so we see Jesse in his Neptune Records T-shirt and and a young boy, and we understand that this is Hank. Now, this is significant for a number of reasons. Right? So first, we heard about Hank, of course, in Before Sunset, but we never saw him. We never saw his face. This is the first time that we are seeing Hank, who is a key character or a key person in the lives of these two people, in particular Jesse. But we'll also find out later in the film how important Hank is in the life of Celine as well. So, but we will talk about that a little bit later. Actually, it's a little bit nuanced how Celine, I think, perceives her relationship with Hank. It's a very interesting one, but it's still one filled with a lot of tenderness, and I would dare say also a kind of motherly type of tenderness from Celine, which I think is very appropriate and also a very lovely thing. But it's also motherly in the sense of being very strict as well, and I'll try to get to that a little bit later if I have time. But the point is that we see Hank for the first time, and this is the first time that we see a very significant character that is related to one of these characters. True, we have seen other characters in the other films. We've seen a lot of other secondary characters in Before Sunrise, for instance. The man along the riverbank who writes the poem, Milkshakes, and we see the fortune teller earlier on, etc. And we see all these other people, the two men at the bridge at the beginning, about the cow in the play. What is it? Bring me the horns of Wilmington's cow. I think that was the play's name, and that sort of thing. So we do see a number of characters, other characters, in Before Sunrise. The same is true for Before Sunset, of course, too. It's in particular in that film, the very beginning with the bookstore and maybe the people asking questions, etc., the driver, and that sort of thing. But those characters were never, that we saw on screen, other than Celine and Jesse, were not directly, I would say, important to Celine and Jesse's lives, right? Hank was someone that we heard about in Before Sunset. Jesse's wife is someone that we heard about in Before Sunset. Celine's grandmother is someone that we heard about in Before Sunrise and in Before Sunset. Celine's boyfriend, the photographer journalist, excuse me, pardon me. The photographer journalist that she talks about in Before Sunset, that's someone we also hear about, but we never see. And so these are characters that, actually I should take that back. We do see a picture of the grandmother, right, in Before Sunset. I should correct myself. We do see a still picture of the grandmother in Before Sunset. It's very quick, it's almost at the end of the film, but it is a still photograph. And this is, I would suggest, maybe similar but also very different, because this time, now in Before Midnight, we see a moving Hank. Hank is there on screen, and he is alive, and he is walking with his father in a fashion that is similar to the close-up of the footsteps that we saw at the beginning of Before Sunrise, when Jesse and Celine arrive in Vienna at the train station. And if you recall, that's the scene where they're walking in the train station, and the camera pans up to their faces, and then they introduce each other because they didn't know their names, and so they introduce their names, and so that has a kind of iconic feel to it. And we also see a similar shot of their feet later on in this film, Celine and Jesse. But it's very curious that we see that same type of shot employed here, but the two people in the shot are Jesse and Hank. So Hank on the left-hand side and Jesse on the right-hand side. And not only that, they are traveling, or they're walking through an airport, right? And so this is a kind of place of movement and going from one place to another, trying to make a connection. Jesse he says at one point, he says, "Do you feel confident about making the connection?" And I think I want to hope and I want to believe that that phrase has a double meaning. And Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy meant it to have a double meaning. Are you confident about making that connection? Not just about planes, but also about connections with life, with people in one's life. And I also want to believe that that line is not referring only to Jesse talking to Hank, but also maybe the director talking to all of us about our views of these characters going forward. Will they make connections? And I think that's a fundamental theme of this film and also of the other two films as well. But this is also very, I think, very interesting too, because up to now we have never seen an airport, right? We've seen train stations. We saw a train station, of course, in particular Before Sunrise, but we never saw anything about airports in Before Sunrise or Before Sunset. We heard about them, of course. If you recall, in Before Sunrise, when they're walking along the riverbank at night, Jesse's asking, "What would you be doing now?" And Celine says, "I wouldn't be in Paris yet. I would have gotten off the train with another man in Salzburg." Or what would you be doing? And Jesse says, "I would be in the airport right now, just waiting for my next flight, crying into my cup of coffee because you didn't agree to come off with me on the train." And so he refers to an airport there as a kind of imaginary place. This is what I would be doing if I wasn't doing what it is I'm doing now. The same actually happens also in Before Sunset, right? Which is this idea of when Jesse is talking to Celine just outside of her apartment, remember? And he wants to hear one of her songs. And she says, no, she first refuses. And he says, "Oh, come on. And I'm paraphrasing, says, what would I be doing now? Just be at the airport now, just waiting. And so I have time, so let's go." So he refers to what he would be doing instead of listening to one of her songs. He would just be waiting at the airport, which is his way of trying to convince her to listen, have him listen to one of her songs. And so that is another kind of parallel universe thing that is going on with the concept of airports. What would I be doing now? I would be in the airport if I weren't here right now. So let's go, let's do this. And so in those two situations, Before Sunrise and Before Sunset, it was always interesting to see how the image of the airport was employed. It was employed as being a kind of parallel universe or a different option that is now closed off to us because now we are living in the moment, right? I'm not doing that at the airport because I'm now here with you. I don't have to worry about time. I would still be doing this at the airport, so I have time now to listen to one song. And so this goes along with this idea that I've tried to talk about up to now, this idea of parallel universes and about the unbearable lightness of being, how we make choices and they close off moments, other options before us, and we have one path in life, and how these concepts can be somewhat contradictory. But also we can see how these contradictory concepts can be used to view these films. And so I really believe that. And it's on that basis that I think that we see this film open up at an airport. That is absolutely fascinating to me, because up to now, as I say, the airport has been almost the imaginary or the alternate universe that has been posited by Jesse. And now we see Jesse with Hank in an airport. And so that immediately brings to mind this notion that the alternative universes are coming to the fore and they're becoming real. And it's almost like this notion of what we've seen up to now, which is that which is not what is now, is now. And I find this notion to be somewhat contradictory to the other films, but I think that contradiction is very important because, as I say, I think that helps in a subtle way to let us know, on the one hand, that these are things that are comfortable to us. This idea of airports traveling is something that is very much familiar in the universe of the before films, right? But at the same time, it does feel different because, as I was trying to suggest, airports, as we've heard them in the other films, have always been imaginary or the alternate universe. Here, they are the real world. And so I find that dichotomy or that contradiction means that maybe we will see other contradictions of a similar nature throughout this film Before Midnight. And so therefore, this opening, as an opening, I think holds a lot of meaning and significance. Not least of which being, of course, the display of the relationship between Jesse and Hank. And we have to put a lot of things together because there are many things that we don't necessarily know at the outset. But we understand that there is still a lot of tension between Jesse and his ex-wife and how that relates to Hank. And we also note the way in which Hank does not say or wave goodbye to his father as he's walking through the security gates and then going off and turning the corner. He doesn't turn to say goodbye one last time. He does say that, oh, this is the best summer of my life. And that line will be a refrain later on through the film because we realize that that line will have double meanings. And it's employed by Jesse too also to have a double meaning. So that's an interesting thing. And so we understand that there is a relationship between these two, father and son, but perhaps it's not the type of relationship that Jesse would think is ideal. And we realize this going forward. And then all the time throughout this scene, we have to wonder, right? Where is Celine, right? Because this is another fascinating component of this opening, which makes it radically different from the earlier films, in that, for the most part, right, the earlier films would have the two of them somehow maybe in the same space or something like that. Maybe we'd have a moment in before. At the beginning, before sunset, with Jesse at the reading in the bookstore in Paris. Or maybe we'd have moments at the beginning of before sunrise where we see Celine sitting by herself on the train with the arguing couple near her, and then she decides to move her seat, and that initiates the entire relationship, as we know. And then we have maybe scenes at the very end of before sunset where they leave, and Jesse goes and walks away, and Celine goes on her train, and then we see Jesse riding alone on his bus, we assume on the way to the airport, and then he sleeps, and then we see Celine sitting alone in her train ride, and then we see her sleep as well. So we do see shots of them either isolated or not necessarily with the other, of course. So that is not anything new. But here it seems different. Right? It seems really different because we are really getting, I think, something that is a relationship or discussion that is not directly related to Celine, right? Even in the opening part of Before Sunset, where you had Jesse talking about his book and everything, we understood that there was a deep connection with his ideas of Celine, because that was the subject of the book, right? And so we understand that Celine was still there, and she was even there present in terms of how the film cut back in flashbacks. Remember that? There will be quick flashbacks to the earlier film, and that meant that Celine was present in the moment even though she wasn't there until she emerges, of course, in terms of she standing at the side there, and we see that she's been there all along. And so in a sense she was there as well, even though we didn't know that she was there until a couple minutes into the film Before Sunset. But that makes this different, Before Midnight, because now Jesse is truly not with Celine. He is focusing in on another human being. This time it's Hank, and it's his relationship with Hank. And this, I think, also is significant because we will come to realize as the film progresses that this is a different Celine-Jesse relationship. And in fact, this issue with Hank will be one of the critical factors that will be part of the discussion of these two characters, Celine and Jesse, as part of their fight or their fights in this film. And so, therefore, we could see this scene, this opening pre-title sequence, as a kind of presentation of the grander themes of this film, namely not just the imaginary becoming real and the emphasis on the real, but also this notion of Hank and fatherhood and how this almost emergency situation that Jesse feels will affect or will have a potentially grave effect on his relationship with Celine. And we will see that play out in this film. And so therefore, this opening sequence, for many, many reasons, I think is critical and key. One of the things I didn't quite get at the time was, why was the sequence included? But now I realize the importance of this sequence, namely to establish the themes of not just this film, but also establish the connections with the other films and the contradictions with the other films. And therefore, this opening sequence is essential. And it doesn't end there, of course, because then we see in a trademark sort of long take, Jesse walk out of the airport, and we follow him walking out. And what happens? He turns the corner, and we see Celine leaning against the car, talking on the phone in French, walking with him to the driver's seat. He closes the door, and the camera then turns to the back seat, and we see two sleeping young girls, and we understand, and we immediately understand so much, right? And then the film cuts to the shot of the car driving and the car's point of view, and before midnight appears on the screen, which also is very similar, if you recall, to the way that Before Sunrise emerged on the screen at the opening of that film, along with the train tracks, right? So there was movement in that film, and there's movement in Before Midnight as well. Perhaps it's a different kind of movement, though. As Celine says in this film, Before Midnight, for a while we were on parallel tracks, but now we are converging. One is going west, the other is going east. And so this idea maybe of movement, but maybe in different directions, as opposed to the movement that we saw in the earlier film, Before Sunrise. But even now, at this point, we think we know kind of what's going on in terms of Jesse and Celine. We understand immediately that they are together. And not only are they together, but they have children with each other, which means that they are in some kind of relationship that is intimate, and they are together, whether it's being married or whether it's being a couple, whatever that is, they are in a relationship. And so we can automatically put together what probably happened at the end of Before Sunset. And so the cliffhanger of Before Sunset has been satisfied, or has been revealed, and realized they are a couple. So that reveals that answer. But even in this opening, there are still certain things that are left unresolved or unexplained. And I think the most crucial one is the relationship between Celine and Hank. I think at the outset of this pre-title sequence, we can assume, by the virtue of the fact that Celine was absent in this airport sequence that we saw in the film, we might assume, I think reasonably so, that the relationship between Celine and Hank, maybe there might be some issues, maybe it's a frosty one, I'm not sure. I think it's very reasonable to make that assumption. But this is actually, this assumption or this expectation is actually upended through the film, because we will realize later in the film, first in the car scene and then later in the hotel scene, we will realize that in fact Celine and Hank have a kind of close relationship, which is really great, but also it's a kind of relationship that for certain reasons will get under Jesse's skin. And so I think this is something that means that this opening sequence, it presents all this information, but it also withholds information. It also creates expectations that are later defied, I would say. So there is a lot going on in this opening sequence, both in terms of establishment of the contents and themes of the film itself, and also establishment of the connections or contradictions with the previous two films. And so I think it is an essential opening, and it's a brilliant opening, and it goes into the next crucial scene, which is the car ride between Jesse and Celine. And this is a remarkable sequence, right? Because it is essentially a collection of a number of long takes. It's not one continuous long take, of course, but it's an assembly of maybe a few long takes where it's just them talking without a cut. It maybe cuts to a shot of the ruins going by, and I'll get to that in a moment. But for the most part, these are long takes, and so they have to sustain, the actors, Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke, they have to sustain this discussion, this dialogue for long stretches of takes. And so it's a remarkable sequence for that reason. Remember the use of the long take in these films. This is very important. We saw the long take employed a lot in Before Sunrise, and we saw the long take employed a lot also in Before Sunset. And the long takes are often described in Linklater films, and in these films in particular, to be the type of utilization of the long take that emphasizes time and emphasizes the effects of time on the characters. These effects aren't universally equal. I would argue that the use of the long take that we saw in Before Sunrise is slightly different than the use of the long take in Before Sunset. In Before Sunrise, it might be described as being almost trying to enjoy the moment, seize the day, the affirmation of the now and the living life. The long take in Before Sunrise, Before Sunset has a similar kind of living the moment vibe, but is also tinged with a sense of melancholy and regret because time has passed between Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. Now in Before Midnight, I would actually argue that it's not anything like living the moment or living the life in a kind of joyous way that we see in the earlier films, including Before Sunset. I would say that this living the moment is instead a kind of almost an emphasis or a re-emphasis on the fact that this now that the two of them are living in is real. And in fact, I think this idea of a reality is at the heart of the use of the long take. And so it's not the same as a kind of affirmation of life that we necessarily saw in Before Sunrise, I would argue. It is a different kind of time. It is the same time, of course, but it is a different kind of time. It is a time that is emphasizing the real and the now. And this idea of reality, this idea of we are living in the moment now, and it is real, this notion of reality will come up again. It has come up before in Before Sunset, this idea that Celine says in the car ride on the way to her apartment at the latter half of that film. She says that reality and love, these are contradictory things about her, and that's one of the things that she cites as being a reason why she can't find herself in a deeply committed relationship. She always seems to break up with the men that she is dating, and that she's dying inside. You remember that? And here, the idea of reality and love seems to be clashing. And it seems like Jesse is trying his best to create some kind of reconciliation while acknowledging that this is real, right? And I'm jumping ahead of myself, but at the very end of the film, his last appeal to Celine is that, what does he say at the very end, which is, let's see, after she says to him, I think it's very simple. I don't think I love you anymore. And his last appeal is, if you want true love, this is it. It's not perfect, but it's real. And if you can't see it, you're blind. He says it's real. Amy makes references to reality, many other parts of the film. For instance, the hotel room. If you remember during the fight, Celine is just saying, "Oh, I don't like this hotel room. I wanted it to be more romantic, like a Greek island setting." And we hear Jesse say, "Oh, I like it. It has it feels real or something." And so this notion of reality is being emphasized, I think, at key moments in this film, and therefore visually, when we see stretches of time presented before us, like in this opening car sequence, I think I can read this as being not necessarily a joyous affirmation type of long take spirit that we saw in, say, Before Sunrise, but rather the focus and the emphasis on the now, which is real. And I think that emphasis on the real is very key. And if we think of the real and love, and maybe those two being perhaps contradictory concepts, then I think this notion of focusing in on the long take, that is the emphasis of the real, I think gains more stature and it becomes more significant. And so the long takes here have a kind of a beautiful time quality to them, but also an emphasis on the real and the now. And I think that is played out in this opening car sequence, right? And we get a lot of information at the outset from the car sequence and what happened to them during these 9 years since we last saw them in the earlier film. We hear about this at the outset. Celine's disappointed about this, the failure of the wind turbine project, whatever it was in Bourgogne. And this therefore convinces her to agree to take the job with Remy, with the government. This is also reminiscent of Before Sunrise. Do you remember where, Before Sunset, where they're talking early in the film, and she's talking about her life and how she used to work for the government, but how she hated it. Oh, it's terrible. And now, then she was working for what was it, Green Cross in that film, which I assume is maybe a private organization, so not a government organ. And she said that she didn't like working for the government. Now she's saying that, oh, maybe I should take that job with the government again, and I think I'll enjoy it. It's a wonderful reversal, and the reversals don't end there. Remember in Before Sunset, and they're talking in the cafe, and she's saying about how the people that she was working with, that she really admired, that they were focused on the little things, right? And I think the example that she gave in that film was they were focused, for instance, on getting pencils to a small village, focusing in on the little things, and those would be the victories that they would have. So, and that meant also as a result, that they didn't have grand ambitions to be political leaders, and that was a kind of sad thing that she was citing in Before Sunset. Here in Before Midnight, that conversation, you notice, is sort of reversed in a very interesting, the tables are being turned in a way. She's referring to the fact that she wants to work with the government, or she's thinking about accepting this job, and she also talks about how, right, she was she was the do-gooder who rolls the boulder up the hill but is always disappointed. And then she says, I want to have ambition now. I want to be I don't want to swear here, but I want to be a B word, and I want to have ambition. This is very different from the details and the non-ambition of the people that she discussed or described in Before Sunset. And so I think, therefore, we see another parallel, but it's also reversed at the same time. And I think this is also an indication of where Celine is versus where she was in Before Sunset. And I think we can glean from this that her life and her life outlook may have altered or may have progressed from the state that she was in Before Sunset. And we will realize throughout the course of the film that I think, yes, there might be some explanation as to why she feels the way she does during this film. But already, again, this is to just emphasize the fact that with this film and the other films, listening to all of the dialogue, I think, is very important. Each line of dialogue, I am convinced more and more, has it rings with a kind of truth or connection with the other films. I'm almost convinced that maybe almost all of the lines of dialogue in one way or another are connected with the earlier films. And so in a very small way, we see in this space of a few minutes, seemingly maybe trivial dialogue is actually very significant, especially when we recall similar but opposite ways in which parallel dialogues were made in Before Sunset. And I think that is absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then she says, right, should I take the job? She's not quite sure. And she says, it's been stirring in me all summer. It's been stirring in me. And we remember the word stirring, it stirred things up. Remember when we heard that before? We heard it in Before Sunset, right? When she's in the car with Jesse and she says, you know what it is? It was your book. It stirred stuff up. That's what she says. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it stirred stuff up, right? And it caused right? We understand now that they are together, which means that in Before Sunset, this being stirred up was so stirred up in a way that it caused her to actually be together with Jesse. So it was a significant life change. A significant life change that has ramifications that we see in Before Midnight. But we hear her using the same word again here. It's been stirring in me all summer. And so I think this is also a big echo, because then we can understand that since she used the word stir before and it led to a very significant change in her life, she's using the same word now. Will it also lead to a significant change in her life, different than what it is now? That's something that we might try to consider if and when there is a fourth Before film. But let's remember that, right? And it's very important too, because this is one of the key reasons, at least as expressed directly in the film, that creates the tension. Of course, there could be more underlying senses of tension between the two characters, other than the fact that she wants to take this new job, but she also feels that Jesse wants them to move to Chicago, which means that she would have to give up this job, right? So that is the source of tension that we understand is brewing up between these two. But maybe it's been there maybe before that. And I think there are some clues in the film that might suggest that Celine, at least Celine anyway, might have been not necessarily feeling the same sorts of feelings towards Jesse that we saw her before. And so this might be the catalyst rather than the cause, if that makes any sense. Although I think there are still many ways to interpret that. But in any event, my friends, she uses the word stir. So that seems to be something that will echo in terms of significance. And we already see how significant it is in terms of the way in which it leads to the very, very huge fight that erupts between them. And we also see that they have different viewpoints, right, in terms of how they interpret the same event. And the event here in question is the idea of taking the apple from one of the daughters, Ella, who the daughters are asleep in the back, and Jesse says, "So is there some of that apple left?" And he takes it, and he eats it, and Celine seems to be looking at this and maybe jokingly, but still maybe in somewhat of disapproval, and she says, stealing food from your daughter, and maybe this will cause some kind of childhood trauma that will carry through her adulthood life. She's joking, or she seems to be in jest here, but then Jesse takes that same moment and turns it and says, it's teaching them a lesson. You snooze, you lose. This idea of being awake and being in the moment, right? And I think that has a lot of parallels with other films too, in that we saw, for instance, in Before Sunrise, the first film, how at the very beginning, do you remember, they're in the train and Jesse's talking about his idea for public access TV, 365 days in the lives of all these people, and it's this thing that he has a kind of, it seems to be of importance to him, and Celine at that time says, "Oh, it's BS." And Jesse also says, he disagrees and says, "Oh, it's the poetry of everyday life." And so even in that early moment, they're looking at the same thing and they're interpreting it in different ways. Well, here it's the same kind of thing that we see at the beginning of this film as well. The stealing of the apple. Jesse looks at it in one way and Celine the other way. And so I think I love that sort of disagreement. And so I think also, if we recall, they were having playful disagreements at the very start of their relationship in Before Sunrise. And so, in a way, in an interesting way, this kind of argument that, or this kind of disagreement that leads to the argument, the big argument in Before Midnight, could be said to be things that, while not necessarily directly relevant to the first film, it still has a kind of echo in the sense that they weren't always on the same page. They weren't always in agreement all the time, even at the first film. They had fights, right, about right, the way in which Celine had been so taken with the fortune teller, and Jesse was a little bit jealous of that, and that led to the whole thing about the poem on the riverbank, etc. Are we having our first fight? And then remember what she says in Before Sunrise. Well, I think having fights is positive. It's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with conflict, right? And right, so this is something that we see echoed in this film rather directly. If you recall, in the hotel scene in the fight, when Jesse is saying, I remember seeing the daughters jumping on the trampoline, and one of them had a hula hoop, and the other one wanted it, and they fought over the hula hoop. And I remember seeing that, and there's fighting and all this negativity. And Jesse looked at that and saw that as a bad thing, as a negative thing. And then Celine turned to really disagreed with that and said, no, I think that's a positive thing. That they're fighting for something that they believe in. And so this is an echo of this idea of her believing that conflict is good. And it's also an echo of the fact that they are interpreting the same event, but in two opposite ways. And that is the crux of their fight, because if you recall, in the hotel scene right after this is where Celine really goes at it and really tries to humiliate Jesse in terms of how boring he is as a sexual partner. You're no Henry Miller. That's what she says. This immediately after this exchange about positive, negativity and positivity. And so this is a kind of a catalyst or a reason for their fight in the hotel room. And if we think of this idea of both of them, each of them interpreting the same event differently, like with the apple, like with the hula hoop, or like with the public access TV show that Jesse mentioned at the beginning of the first film, then I think we can see that perhaps, yes, the echoes of their fight were started way back in the first film. And so I think it's very interesting to think of it that way. And also I should mention too an interesting detail about how Jesse says in the film here about the apple. He says, "You snooze, you lose." This is also made in jest. I get that, but if you recall, also the other thing that's very important that will also be sort of echoed later on in the film, in the hotel scene, is this idea of sleeping and being awake. And how this was the idea of, it's important to be awake. The idea of being awake is somehow meaning that we are living our lives. And I think, if we sleep, we are not living. I think that's the implication of this joke that he's making. And I'd like to think that this has a nice connection in parallel with the first film, if you recall, Before Sunrise, which is that whole film was about being outside of time, and the two characters being in their own world. It was almost like Cinderella, like a fairy tale. We see fairy tales here mentioned in Before Midnight as well, but in Before Sunrise, the first film, it was a kind of fairy tale. In that they acknowledged that it was a kind of fairy tale, but they wanted to stay awake. They wanted to live the life, live the moment. It was only as the film ended and the two went off on their separate ways that they fell asleep, if you recall. Here, this idea of sleep and being awake is also a theme that's very important, but we will see it played out in a slightly different way. And again, it is mentioned in the hotel scene as well. But let's keep that in mind: sleeping state and the waking state. And I think it's made apparent even in this little joke, "You snooze, you lose." Now, this is yet another example of why I think each line in this film is absolutely crucial. And we should say also that this is the idea of remembering childhood also, and the notion of remembering childhood, and this leads to the story of Celine and her cat, Cleopatra that she had when she was younger, and the story about how Cleopatra would go out of the house and come back, and Cleopatra would be pregnant, and that Celine would remember that the cat would always give birth to 2 kittens. Well, she then found out the truth many, many years later. She says around when she was 30, I think. She was having lunch with her father, and her father explained the horrible truth about what he did with the litter of kittens, and what that meant in terms of really scarring her viewpoint of her own childhood. It's interesting to recall that story, of course, for a number of reasons. In terms of the details, she says that she was 30 when she had this lunch with her father, which would mean that she had that lunch before the events of Before Sunset, right? Because she is, 31 or 32, I want to say, I think it's 32 in Before Sunset. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but so 30 is of course younger than 32. And there was also a cat also in Before Sunset. Do you remember that? It was Che, the cat who would always wake up, and every morning was a new morning. Everything was always new, which is also a very interesting thing. That seems to be a parallel to something that we'll see later in Before Midnight as well. But my point is that, and this idea of remembrance as well is very important too. Here Celine is remembering something, and she's remembering something about her childhood, and then she realizes that it wasn't real, that in fact it was actually much more horrific than what she remembered it to be. And recall also in Before Sunset, there was an episode when they're walking in the gardens about how she remembers, there was this thing about she had this memory about walking home from piano lessons at night, and she'd see a sort of a pervert man, and how this pervert man would sort of expose himself or something, and that seemed to inform her maybe sexuality growing up. And in fact, she realized that never happened. And so she recalled a memory that never happened. Well, here in Before Midnight, she is expressing a similar concept, namely recalling a memory that in fact wasn't what it actually was in reality. And so this is very, very interesting because it's a sort of a parallel with what we saw in Before Sunset, namely, this idea of memory. And Jesse says in that film, we are still living in the memory. Here in Before Midnight, later in the film, remember Celine and Jesse are talking as they're walking to the hotel, and she says, I think that we're living in a memory, in a dream. And so it's this idea of not just living in memories, but this idea of maybe the fact that we remember it gives life to things, even though they might not necessarily have played out in reality. So I think that's an interesting concept. Although I should mention that I think that the Before Midnight anecdote about the cat Cleopatra and what actually happened and what her father did with the litter of kittens each time, I think that is a neat little twist on it, in that not only is it concerned with the idea of memory, even though it might not necessarily reflect what happened, but recall that Celine said that she had lunch with her father when she was 30, and he told her what actually happened inadvertently. And so he inadvertently told her the truth. So in an interesting way, reality and memory clashed, right? Reality and memory clashed such that she now realized that the memory was false and reality was something even more horrific. And that is also going to the heart of what I was mentioning earlier, which is that in this film Before Midnight, there's this idea of reality, real, and what that means vis-a-vis the concept of a kind of true love. Does that really exist or not in reality? And I think we'll see later in the dinner scene, or the sort of the banquet scene with all the couples, there's this idea that will be taken away with that, which is maybe there is no idea of a soulmate or true love, but in fact there's something about life and now and reality. And so I think that is at the heart of this film, and I think even this little anecdote about Cleopatra, the cat, is playing with that very, very directly. So, I should say one more thing, and I'll go to the live chat. I'm sorry, I'm soaking up all the time here. But another thing about this too is that recall also that it's around this time that they pass the ruins. They're driving by the ruins. You know, one of their daughters, I think it was Ella, who mentioned earlier that she had wanted to stop by the ruins, and I think it's Jesse who says, you know, right, it's you snooze, you lose, right? You should have been up, but we'll be driving through. We're not going to stop by. Maybe we'll stop by on the way back. Maybe not, right? And so this is very interesting. And Celine seems to be somewhat disapproving, but she's passively going along with this. So though she is a little bit hesitant to do so, trying to convince Jesse to stop, of course, but he doesn't. And so this is very interesting too. This has been mentioned, I think, in one of the Criterion supplements as being somewhat a sign of being different than what we saw of Celine and Jesse when they were younger in the earlier films. In other words, Celine and Jesse would have maybe their younger selves might have stopped, right? Because they were always intellectually curious and they were eager to stop by these sites, etc. But they didn't stop by here now. We'll see later in the film they'll stop by a little church, and there will be a little scene there. So that's an indication of maybe the younger selves of Jesse and Celine. But they didn't stop by the ruins here, and it was to the detriment of their children. And so maybe this is an indication of them not being the selves that they were when they were younger, right? Because we can assume that they might have stopped had they been their younger selves, but they aren't now. So this is another change or another indication. Although we can, of course, always question this or add a separate or different alternative interpretation to this, because even if recall, say, the earlier films in, say, Before Sunrise, we did see Celine stopping by. There was maybe a picture of a museum exhibition poster, and she was the one who stopped and looked at it, and she expressed interest, etc. And when the fortune teller comes, she was the one who's interested in it, whereas Jesse was a little bit disengaged. The same is true for the poet on the riverbank there, the milkshake, right, if you recall. And so, right, this dynamic that we see with the ruins could be said to be consistent with the dynamic that we've seen all along. Namely, it's Celine who seems to be actively interested in these things of culture, if you will, whereas Jesse occasionally shows a disengagement or being uninterested, right? And so maybe in that way, this scene in Before Midnight with the ruins is really consistent with what we've seen in Before Sunrise, etc. But again, that could be countered, of course, with the sequence in Before Sunset, where, remember, as they're walking along the Seine River, and it's Jesse who says, let's go on the ferry, that little ferry taxi, I think, across the river there. And Celine at first hesitates, but it's Jesse who initiates that. So that could be seen as being something of Jesse trying to initiate something that is a kind of cultural sort of engagement or something along those lines. Although even that moment in Before Sunset could be interpreted in a different way. It could be interpreted to be Jesse trying to just make more time with Celine rather than necessarily trying to enjoy the moment, enjoy the Seine, etc. like that. So maybe that is more of an exception to the general interpretation that, yes, Jesse has, generally speaking, shown disengagement from the very get-go, but it's Celine who's trying to be actively engaged in these sorts of cultural things. So maybe this car scene isn't so far removed from the Jesse and Celine that we knew way back from Before Sunrise. But again, that's for your consideration, of course. And then the last thing is then we get the discussion between Jesse and Celine with respect to Hank. And this is where we realize that Hank and this idea of maybe this was the best summer of my life has a different meaning, because Hank basically met a girl, and he basically hit it off with this girl, and they kissed and that sort of thing. So already this exchange, this discussion about Hank reveals so many things at once. And I'll get to this, and I'll get to the live chat, I promise. So the first thing it reveals is that mother to maybe stepson kind of relationship, and that Hank confides in Celine. That's what Celine says. And Celine says, "Oh, I swore I would keep the secret," but then she reveals a little bit about Hank and what happened between Hank and this girl, Melina, who's mentioned, and how there was a kiss, and she said she was sworn to secrecy, etc., and that he was worried about, concerned about his looks and that sort of thing. And so this is interesting because this shows, of course, that there is already a rift between Celine and Jesse vis-a-vis Hank. It seems like Celine and Hank have a kind of relationship that involves secrets being kept from Jesse, and we will see later that even in this scene, the phone will be the phone will ring for Celine, and we understand that that was Hank. Calling from the airport, or maybe on the plane just before it's going to go off. And this is interesting too, because if you recall from Before Sunrise, remember at the very beginning, Celine saying, you know, she hates riding on airplanes because she's always afraid of death. And so there's a little bit of an echo there about, you know, just being sure with respect to airplanes and that sort of thing here in Before Midnight. But also more fundamentally, I think we see that there is a relationship between Celine and Hank that I think will lead to some kind of jealousy on the part of Jesse later on in the film. And we will see that. We will see that play out, I think, most outwardly in the hotel fight. But this, therefore, serves to be a defiance of expectations that I was referring to that seem to have been set up at the very pre-credit sequence, namely that we didn't see in the pre-credit sequence, Celine and Hank interact, so maybe that indicates a coolness in their relationship. But in actual fact, their relationship seems to be very close, as indicated in this later scene in the car. So that is very important. Also, this is important too because this serves to be an echo of earlier films, as I say, so specifically Before Sunrise. So this story about Melina and Hank and their summer together, and they fell in love, and maybe they'll keep in touch on Facebook or something afterwards. This really has a lot of echoes with the story, do you remember, from Before Sunrise, when they're on the tram in Vienna, Celine and Jesse, and Jesse asks, "What was your first sexual experience?" And Celine talks about the summer that she had when she was a little girl or young girl, and she's talking about the swimmer. What was his name? Jean-Marc Fleury. He was a swimmer, and so there was this, and they got together, but then after the summer it just faded away and that sort of thing. And so that has a similar kind of echo with Hank and Melina, but this time maybe they'll stay together because of there's Facebook. Yet another difference between the summer of '94 and now, which also I'll get to a little bit later, but that's an interesting echo. So this scene is also very important because yet it serves yet again as another echo for the earlier films. And before I go, this is the last thing I promise, and I'll go to the live chat. There's another echo, which is very subtle, but also very important, I think. Just as this is happening, remember there's this little joke between Celine and Jesse in the car, and she says, because she's talking about Hank and he's worried about his pimples or something. And then this leads her to say to Jesse, you never stop ogling girls. And then Jesse says in that sort of put on European accented voice, you know, I make love to them with my eyes. And I think this is a joke, right? Of course it's a joke, but it also has certain undercurrents that we will see run through later in the film, because of course at the climactic fight, Celine will accuse Jesse of infidelity, and Jesse's answer or non-answer in that particular moment, I think, makes one reasonably assume that indeed, yes, the likelihood is very high that maybe Jesse did in fact commit an act of being unfaithful and with another woman. And so that rings very poignantly and very directly with this joke that we see at the very beginning. You know, I make love to them with my eyes. So he sees and he watches and he he looks at other women, right? This also has an echo with Before Sunrise in a very subtle scene. I don't know if you recall it, but you remember the scene? I think it was they were going into the bar, and then they were going to play pinball. So just as they were going to go in, they're outside and they're walking, and we hear them. And Jesse has this whole talk about technology and how technology is supposed to save us time, etc. And then Celine says in Before Sunrise, what she says, time is abstract, I think, which is a very key line, I think. But recall there was a moment there, if you go back to Before Sunrise and fast forward to that moment, but there's a really brief moment where there's another couple walking in the opposite direction as they're walking towards the door. And you hear Celine says, oh, you're looking at that other woman or something? And nothing is made of it, ever. And that's it. Jesse doesn't respond and nothing like that. And then they go into the bar and that's it. And it's never picked up again. Although one can say that it's picked up again here. He is saying, right, you all go with other women. He says, I make love to them with my eyes. And so this is a kind of return, if you will, of almost a throwaway line in Before Sunrise. But it's a throwaway line in Before Sunrise that becomes a throwaway line kind of in Before Midnight. But then it develops into one of the key components of the fight between the two of them in the hotel, namely the accusation of infidelity. And so if we think of it in those terms, then this kind of the trajectory of their fight really has its roots, in one way of looking at it, in the very first film. And so I find that echo to be actually very significant in a very subtle and, again, throwaway line sort of way, but again, significant. And it's another example of where I think each line of this film carries a lot of weight. And so, I think you can tell my excitement, I hope, by the fact that I'm just keeping talking here, and I'm very sorry about that. So I will remedy that right now and just go to the live chat, and we'll go from there. So let's see. Again, I'm just going to skip around here. So if I skip your comment, I apologize. Let's see. Dennis A here is, hello, Dennis A. Hello. It's nice to see you as always. Let's see. Bri Guy 2000 says, I will say without spoilers, Midnight was the weakest of the trilogy, and it did get me Marriage Story vibes a little bit. Oh, yes. So, let's see. There are similarities between those films, I think. And Daniel Valdez says, it looks to me like you're the expert. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Let's see. Just skipping around here. Oh, the video connoisseur, hello. It's nice to see you, my friend. Thank you. Excuse me. Dennis A says, also, I will say that Celine is my favorite character in the previous two movies, and in Before Midnight, I see a side of her that I cannot stand. I think Jesse calls her the mayor of Crazy Town. She is. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. She seems to be, you suggest that we see a different side of her here in this film than we did necessarily in the earlier films. And I can see that. I can certainly see that kind of interpretation. Although, I would suggest that there were hints and there were actually revelations early on in the earlier films that make her character, as we see it here, very, very consistent. And I would also add that in the fight between Jesse and Celine, and of course I will get to that later because I think that deserves its own section of this live stream, the fight, but I think it's very natural for a viewer like me or anyone who watches this film to side with one of the characters more than the other. One wants to side with Celine, maybe, or one understands more what Jesse is saying, etc. And so I think that also might affect how one sees the characters. But what you say is very interesting. You say that you say that Celine was your favorite character in the previous two movies, but you saw a different side of her here. So that is also very interesting. So the fact that she was your favorite character before would suggest to me on the one hand, that the inclination might have been there for you to side more with her in the fight scenes here, but you say the opposite was the case, right? So that is a very interesting thing. So I find that to be a really dynamic reading, which I respect very much. Excellent reading. I would say, though, just to round out my comment here, that there were echoes of this particular side of Celine, if we want to call it that. But remember in Before Sunrise, the first film, when they're walking across the river, they're walking, not Seine, but they're walking along the riverbank because it's Vienna. They have their first fight, right? And she says, if we were together, what would be what would be something that you would what is it? She asked the question, what would be something that would drive you crazy, or what would be something that you want to change? So this questioning of Celine to Jesse first started in Before Sunrise. Remember, she's questioning him like this almost frequently throughout this film. What was it? What does she say in the Before Sunrise? If we were to think, what would be the thing that you what would be the thing that you wouldn't be able to stand, right? Here in Before Midnight, what would be the one thing you want to change about me? And it's almost the same question that she's asking here, and that leads to the idea of manipulation. Not only on the part of Celine trying to manipulate him into creating an answer, but also on the side of Jesse, because we see him deflecting and then turning the tables and almost asking a similar question towards her. And we see that operating at the very start, or not the start, but at the very beginning film, the first film, as they're walking along just before they meet the poet. And so that is very interesting. So there is an echo there of this kind of manipulation, again, on both sides. And also an interesting thing, do you remember at that same scene in Before Sunrise, which is that she describes herself, the younger Celine, as being like a general, right? Do you remember that? I'm like a general, and because I always try to get my boyfriend's weaknesses, and I try to use the weaknesses against him, like a general in an army or something like that. And so she uses these sort of military metaphorical terms to describe the way she sees herself as naturally inclined to want to use the weaknesses of her lover or boyfriend against them. And that is very interesting, because that has echoes with Before Midnight in a number of ways, of course. In the fight, she actually uses excuse me, she uses Jesse's sexual proclivities against him. You're no Henry Miller, she says. And she tries to berate him and put him down in terms of you do your thing. You go on your book tours and your university tours while I'm here taking care of the kids and spending my time. What's the name? Do you know the name of their pediatrician, etc., and that sort of thing. And so she is using this stuff against him, and so she is the general that she described herself being in Before Sunrise, which is a very interesting development. It's even made more interesting by the fact, do you remember later in the car ride when they stop in the grocery store before they have their big banquet with everyone else there in Greece? Remember what she says? How she describes herself? Okay, I'm the general, right? And then they go off and do their shopping in the grocery store. I know it's probably meaningless, but we have to remember that these films echo each other, and I think it might seem like trivial, but I do want to believe that there is a purpose to all of the lines that are being spoken here. And so, yes, we have seen this kind of progression of the fight going forward. And I think it was predicted also by Jesse in the first film as well. Remember when they're in the park and he's saying, getting tired of myself. I'm tired of myself, and talking about, what if we're together and you get sick of my pseudo-intellectual discussions that I have all the time with our friends and that sort of thing. And that is in a way predicting the kind of fight, the kind of situation that they'll be having in Before Midnight. So in an interesting way, both Celine and Jesse, in their own ways in the first film, are kind of predicting what is going to happen to them if they were to become a couple in Before Night, which in itself is already being predicted by the first film itself, by the opening passage of the film, right? What do we see? What, the bickering couple on the train? This is the middle-aged couple, which is kind of what Celine and Jesse have become in Before Midnight. And so but to return to your initial point about this being a kind of different side of Celine, I would actually suggest that this is indeed the side of Celine that has been there, but it's just been manifest in a very intense way in this film. She's still talking about herself as being kind of, what does she describe herself as being in the early film? Like an icon of feminism. And remember, one of the sources of her frustration that she expresses in the fight is how she doesn't have time, and that her dreams have been taken from her. And what did she say? Remember, it's like the at work she saw those magnets on the refrigerator, and they were spelled out. What is it? Women explore for eternity in the vast garden of sacrifice. That's what she says she saw on the refrigerator magnets there. And she says, this giving up my hopes. And she says, this is bigger than me. This is a thing about womanhood. And how, and she says it earlier, right? She says how, earlier in the film, how, men, they're talking about men comparing themselves, and how, Jesse wants to compare himself to other notable authors, male authors, and how they had these great masterpieces when they were young, in their 20s, etc., writing masterpieces before eating breakfast. And then Celine retorts and says, what about female famous persons in history, about how they weren't necessarily concerned about that because they had much greater odds stacked against them, and so their successes would likely come when they were older, when they were in their 50s, etc. And so this is speaking directly to her views of not just her views of herself in the context of the type of feminism that she has been talking about the entirety of this series, from the very beginning and all the way through the middle of the film, and how she is, excuse me, and the idea of her work and her devotion. And so she sees Jesse as taking that away, or at least that's how she's expressing it at one point in the fight. And so my point is that we've seen echoes of this, and so this is really a side of Celine, or an aspect or a facet of her character that is consistent with the first two films. And even in the first two films, right? Don't forget, especially the first film, I do want to just recall that they had disagreements about male and female viewpoints, and remember about how like the female insect would bite the heads off of male that sort of thing, and the idea of the male female relationships. They had tense moments in Before Sunrise, the first film, and those moments, I would suggest, are consistent with the very intense fight that they have, at least in some components of it, in the hotel room. So, in fact, I would suggest that it's consistent with what we've seen in the first two films. It's just been made even more directly manifest and made more personal between Jesse and Celine. In fact, perhaps the difference would be that in the first two films, and especially in the first film, Celine never went so far as to want to purposefully insult Jesse. Where here in Before Midnight, she just really does not hesitate, and she really is using it as a way of fighting him. And so I think that might be the difference. And so, but in any way, but in that regard, I completely understand what it is you're saying, Dennis. So well said, my friend. Well said. Okay, so just skipping down here. So, oops, sorry about this. And sorry about this. Okay. Excuse me here. I am just struggling with the live chat, as I often do. So I apologize. So Rico is here. Hello, hello. Let's see. Yes, David Recca says, the seeds of the arguments were planted in the earlier films. Yes, what a brilliant point. Thank you, thank you. After some time, I'd like to go back and watch Sunrise and Sunset again with that idea in mind. Yes, yes, this is so important. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to watch the earlier films after you've seen Before Midnight, and the connections just are like fireworks. And that's one of the reasons why I really grew to love this film more than I did on my initial viewing, which is that I saw this film and then I saw the earlier films again, and then I saw this film and I realized it's all connected. Okay, so let's just move on, and I'll try to explain why. I'm so sorry about this, but so this is very important, right? This idea of the connections and the parallels, and the reason why I think it's important is for many reasons, because it creates thematic links. These are the same characters that have been traveling with us, or we have been traveling with them throughout these now 3 films, and so it's, I think, reasonable to expect and understand that there will be links and there will be connections, and these sorts of thematic connections in a trilogy are very natural and very reasonable to have. But I don't think it ends there, because I think also the idea of having connections like this really goes at the heart of one of the readings of these films, which I think is very important, which is that these films can also be read to be kind of alternate universes. The idea of alternate or parallel universes, the Borges idea of the multiple universes, multiple lives that can be lived out at the same point in time. And I really believe that. And so it is possible to look at these films as being almost like parallel universes, and that maybe in one of these parallel universes that Jesse and Celine actually did meet up 6 months later after the summer of '94 in Vienna once again, and their lives became different. Or maybe in another parallel universe, Jesse and Celine didn't get together at the end of Before Sunset, and Jesse caught his plane at the end there, and then he went back to his wife and his son Hank, and then he lived out his life with his wife and his son in America. Or maybe there's another parallel universe that says that, we'll go to the, I'll just skip to the end here with Before Midnight. Are they going to be together, or are they going to be splitting up? And I would say that there's enough room for either interpretation. So there could be parallel universes here in that maybe they're together or maybe they are apart. But the point I want to bring up is that with this concept, this is the idea that the echoes that we see in this with the other films bring to mind the idea that maybe this idea of parallel universes isn't far-fetched, and that especially in the context of Before Midnight, this idea of we are living in a memory and a dream. That's what Celine says around the middle of the film as they're walking. And maybe we are, and this is very significant too, because remember what Jesse says. He says, "Oh yeah, you say that a lot. You really say that." And why does he say this? Because Celine has said this before in earlier films. Do you remember when she was in the church in Vienna in Before Sunrise? Remember, she says, well, Jesse says in the church, what does he say? I think I'm a young boy dreaming I'm a young man. And then Celine says, I think I'm the opposite. I think I'm an older woman dreaming I'm a young woman. And so maybe that leads one to the idea that maybe all this is a parallel existence. And she says that again in Before Sunset, a similar concept when they're on the boat. And Jesse asks, what were the chances of us meeting again? I'd say close to zero, but what they say, right? And I'm paraphrasing. We're like those people. We are people in the old lady's dream. The old lady that's dying on her deathbed. We are in her dream, and so yes, it was possible for us to meet. And so she expresses that idea that yes, maybe they are living in a dream, and she expresses that concept here too in Before Midnight. Maybe we are living in a dream or a memory, and so maybe this isn't going to exist at all. And I mentioned parallel universes even in the nuanced way in the terms of airports at the beginning. It's expressed here too in the fight. Remember when they're fighting and the fight reaches a little bit of a standstill, or a little bit of a lull, or a calm spot, so to speak, where Celine is trying, I think, to comfort Jesse about how, Jesse, you were a good father. It couldn't be helped. You divorced your wife and you missed out on those years with Hank, and you can never get those back, but you were a good father. And then Jesse's expressing a lot of remorse at this point. But then you remember what Celine says, I think, and the idea that they divorced, Jesse and his now ex-wife divorced because of Celine, because of the sexual encounter that we assume Jesse and Celine had at the end of Before Sunset. And so we understand, therefore, that Celine sees herself as being the cause of the breakup between Jesse and his wife, now ex-wife. But what does Celine say in relation to this in the same scene, which is very interesting? In the hotel, she says, but I think you would have gotten divorced anyway, right? Even if I weren't there, right? Or you would have stayed together married and you would have been miserable. And so she is in that moment expressing two alternate universes in that same instant, which is a remarkable thing, because what is she doing in that? She's not just only expressing multiple universe possibilities, but she's also expressing the idea that even in multiple universes or multiple options or possibilities, the result would have been the same. You would have been miserable. You would have been miserable. And so you were miserable now, or you were miserable in this alternate option, or you were miserable in this alternate option. The result is the same. And so I find that to be utterly fascinating, which is this idea that how different are the alternate options, really? How different are they really? I mean, in the short term, yes, they might be different, but in the long term, are they really that different? If we have something here, we will always feel like we are losing this. If we live this world, we will always feel that we are losing out on this. We will never have what it is we are missing in this world. We will never have what we are missing in this other world, etc. And so we will always have this feeling of wanting something that we don't have. So I think that hypothesis that was being posited, it wasn't, I didn't start it. I'm borrowing from much smarter people. This idea of reading these films as a possible reading of these films as being alternate universes, all acting at once, and we can add waking life in there as well, right? But what the Before Midnight film does, I think, is it posits in this one moment that Celine expresses in the hotel fight scene, which is extraordinary. She expresses the notion that maybe it wouldn't have been different in any scenario. And if that's the case, I find that to be another almost soul-crushing, concept, in that maybe our lives are really fated to lead to one conclusion. Are we really going to change? And it goes into the fundamental question, right? It's not just the idea of alternate universes, which I think can lead to maybe science fiction type of concepts. No, it also leads to the idea of ourselves. Do we really change? Are we really capable of change? Even if the circumstances are different, will we change? Maybe the answer is no. We will always stay the same. And thinking of it like that, I find that this moment means that we are now further linked into the other films. I'll give you an example. Do you remember in Before Sunset, when they're in the gardens again, and Jesse is talking about, again, I'm paraphrasing, this anecdote or study that he heard about the people who win the lottery and the people who become handicapped, and how if you're miserable and you win the lottery, you'd still be miserable, but if you're hopeful and you become handicapped, you would still be hopeful and optimistic. And so that leads to the idea, even in parallel alternative circumstances, the fundamentals of the human being would stay the same. And so therefore, I think back on that moment only in the context of Before Midnight, and I realized there is something more profound going on in these films, in that a reading of the films in terms of alternate realities, I think, works. But ultimately what I think the film is saying, or at least what Celine is saying in Before Midnight, and what Jesse is inertly saying the same thing in Before Sunset, is that people don't change. Even when there is change, people still stay the same. And that also leads to the question, well, if people fundamentally don't change, then what are the hopes, really? What are the hopes of Jesse and Celine at the end of this? Are they really going to change? If I've just said, well, the films seem to say that people don't change, if that suggests, therefore, that Jesse and Celine won't change because they don't change, then what does that say about the relationship post Before Midnight? I don't know. I think it's still up in the air, but it is possible, and I'm going a little bit ahead of myself here, but I think it is possible to think of the possibility that if we ever get another film before whatever, I don't know what it could be called, but if we do get another film 9 years from 2013, which is by my count 2022, so that's not very far from now. If we were to get another film, I wouldn't be surprised if they were not together in this fourth film. Now, I don't know how that would work out. I don't know what would be the plot. I'm not sure, but it is possible that they were separated, and they are separated now. And for whatever reason, maybe it has to do with their children. I'm not sure. They come together, and that leads to the events in the film. And who knows? Maybe they're still together, and that leads to another fourth film. I'm not sure, but I do think there is room for the possibility that they are going to split up, or they have split up after Before Midnight. And that's because of the idea of the hypothesis that's being posited, is that even when things change, people still stay the same. Jesse and Celine also kind of mention this in different points of the films when they're talking about in the film Before Midnight. Remember when they're starting their walk to the hotel, Celine makes reference to a letter that 20-year-old Jesse wrote to 40-year-old Jesse, and how what 20-year-old Jesse was writing about are still the same concerns that 40-year-old Jesse is concerned about. So in other words, people don't change. Even the things that young people, when people were young and they were writing about, those concepts and concerns are still alive in them even now. Celine made a similar point, if you recall, in Before Sunset, when she's talking around the middle of the film, again, when they get into the garden area, about how she was looking at one of her journals from, it was the conversation about how, did they have sex in the park in Vienna or didn't they? And she says, oh, I'll check my journal, but I don't think I did. And then this leads to a discussion about journals, and about how she says she looked at one of her journals, right, from, was it 83? And she says she was much younger then, of course, than she was now, but she was so surprised about how what she was writing about then are still the same concerns about the same concerns that she has now. And so people don't change. Excuse me. People don't change. And so that's a kind of fundamental conceit that runs not just through this film, but also through the other films. And so that leads me to the possibility that maybe they don't stay together. It is possible they don't stay together, but it's possible they do stay together, because there are a number of clues, I think, that go both ways. But of course, a number of clues that go in the way that they don't stay together are the fact that, in particular, Celine makes reference to the fact that this is the, what does she say? This is where it ends, she says in the car ride. This is how people start breaking up. This is the day you, lit the ticking bomb that will destroy our lives. And so, and again, the ticking sound, again, it's a reference to time, but not time in the sense of enjoying time and living the life and being in sort of an unreal sense of time. This is real time, and it's a real time that leads to sort of dire consequences, namely the end of their relationship. Or at least that's the implication with the metaphor that she uses with the bomb and the ticking bomb. It's interesting to remember when the other time when she mentioned bomb in another film, it was Before Sunset, right? When she says, and she's talking about her then boyfriend were in India, and they passed by she says bum, and Jesse hears her and says, "You mean bomb?" And she says, "No, bum." And that's interesting. She mentions the word bomb in the context of a discussion of her photographer boyfriend at the time. And then now, of course, they've broken up. So now she's mentioning the word bomb again. But this time she's with Jesse. So what does this mean? I mean, I don't know if we can attach or fix too much weight to it, but it's interesting that she mentions bomb in that relationship, and then now they're not together. Now she's mentioning bomb here in the context of ticking time, passing, and what will happen to the relationship with Jesse. Who knows? But what does she say? I'm actually surprised it lasted this long. And then this leads to the middle sequence, one of the middle sequences of the film, with the banquet and the meeting of the people at the house of the writer and Patrick's house. And so this brings up a lot of concepts, right? Which is, we understand that Jesse wrote a number of books, right? So this time, and then that time, and then temporary cast members of a long-running but little-seen production of a play called Fleeting. So that sounds a little bit pretentious. It sounds almost along the lines of, bring me the horns of Wilmington's cow. But I think he is most popular as an author for the first two books. We'll see later in the hotel. The front desk will ask for autographs, not just from Jesse, but from Celine, which I think is a very sort of demeaning thing to do for Celine. Poor Celine at that point, but that a little bit later. But here we have the meeting of various couples and talking about various aspects of relationships. We also see Jesse and him talking about his novels, his ideas for more stories. And we have seen this before in other films, right? We saw him talking about his public access TV show idea in Before Sunrise, the first one. We also heard him a little bit talking about his idea for the next novel, about how it would take place all within the space of a pop song, and the idea of dancing. The daughter dancing on the cars to a song on the radio makes the guy think back to a time when he was with his young love, dancing to the same song, and they're in the same moment and together. And that's parallel with Celine being in Before Sunrise and being in Before Sunset in the exact same moment. And so this idea of time and perception of time has been always at play in these ideas that Jesse has been expressing, even from the first two films. Well, here it's the same. We have this idea, he's saying that he has this idea of having an assembly of characters, each with their own a sort of psychological, or not psychological, sort of a kind of a, what does he say, brain abnormalities. That's how he described it. So one person experiences constant deja vu, someone who can't recognize anyone, and then another person who recognizes too much. And he also tries to set it in different time periods with respect to the film On the Waterfront. And a character like Achilles, the young man who's there in the villa, and he's saying this character sees, what does he say, sees the transient nature of everything, and seeing this idea of what will happen at the very end of this thing. He sees the sea and he just sees the fossils that will result at the end of evolution. Or he sees a book and he thinks, oh, who will be the last person to have this book before it's destroyed, or that sort of thing. Okay, so there is so much even in this segment here, and I don't want to belabor the point too much, but let me just throw out there just for your consideration. Okay, so this idea of the character, transient nature of things, looking at things and thinking about only death, right? These films are preoccupied with death. Celine and Jesse are, in particular Celine, sort of preoccupied with the notion of death. She always has been from the very first film, and we see it here as well. They talk about their own deaths. They talk about their funerals. She says, I would like you to attend my funeral. We'll see who outlives the other, and that sort of thing, because they're talking about that in the context of the death of Jesse's grandmother. We found that in the course of the film that his grandmother died, And so that leads to the concept, the discussion of death. But death has always been there. But recall also in Before Sunrise, there was a little anecdote that Jesse gives about how he had a friend who was having a home birth. And when the baby was born, the first thing that the friend could think was when it's going to die. And so that is an early example of someone that he describes seeing sort of the transient nature of life. But he's repeating that here again in this novel idea pitch. And this is also something that is, I think, reflective of Jesse. We understand that he borrows a lot from real life. And he borrows a lot from Celine as well. And Celine seems to resent this, which I think is also very important. And so Jesse, and we remember Celine described Jesse in the second film as being, you took that night from me, and you stole it from me, and you just took it from me. And that seems to have echoes with what she is complaining about here. And I think very rightfully so. About how when people read the second book, it's like they understand what it's like to have sex with her, because the idea is that Madeline, I think her name is in the book, is patterned after Celine, which is a kind of a sort of very almost gross violation of privacy. I don't know how you feel, but I feel very sympathetic towards Celine's position in that regard, because I would feel very violated if a book was like that, and it revealed a very intimate nature about my own character and about my own being. And so I completely understand how she feels about that. But we do see, therefore, Jesse takes things from real life and interprets them and puts them into his own books. And also, just another little point about the idea of the one of the characters not remembering anything. It reminds me a lot of Che, the cat in Before Sunset. How the cat would always wake up, and every morning would be a new morning. So it's almost like the cat would always forget things, and so that's almost like the guy and one of the characters in this new book, right? But this leads also to the couples here, and we have different couples. We have Patrick and Natalia. So they are the elderly couple. They're not really a couple, actually. They're friends, because Patrick, we understand, is married, but his wife is not there. And Natalia's husband has passed away. Elias, he's passed away. And she gives a very moving monologue about him, which is also very significant. But the other couples are Ariadne and Stephanos, and also Anna and Achilleus. And I don't have time right now, but just know that the actors who are playing these characters, they're very deeply connected with Greek cinema. And so, just in case you're interested, but just in the context of this film, these characters, I think, are here. And I must admit that when I first saw this film, Before Midnight, this section, the section with these various couples, and Celine and Jesse also mixed in, this section was one of the sections that I was most critical of, because I always felt that it was a little bit too on the nose in many respects. And I didn't necessarily, it was more time with these couples and less time with Celine and Jesse, which is what I was expecting. So that's how I felt then. But now, looking at the film many times, I see that this sequence is absolutely crucial to my understanding of the film Before Midnight. And I'll try to explain why, which is that each couple seems to be, one way of looking at it, of course, and this is, again, not my own idea, but each couple seems to be a kind of reflection of a possibility of how Celine and Jesse's relationship can turn out, or what it could have been when they were younger. And so this is yet another example of a kind of parallel universes, or different avenues of life. And when we make one choice, all the other avenues close off before us, and we can never choose those again. Well, here on the table, it seems almost in a very extraordinary way, we are seeing different possibilities play out at the same time. And it is, in that sense, this scene is absolutely amazing. Okay, so to be specific, so we have Celine and Jesse, And then we have the young couple, which is Anna and Achilles. And this is very interesting because they describe how they met last summer and how they met because Anna was having the after party of the Shakespeare play that she was in. And they met at that party, and then they had their night together. And he had a motorcycle, and she was riding along with it. And she had to go back to the theater, and the theater was empty by that point in time. And he was on the stage, and she was in the back row, and the acoustics were great, according to what she said. And he whispered something, and the acoustics were so great that even though he was on the stage and she was sitting in the last row, he whispered something, and a few seconds later, she could hear it. What did he say? They asked him. No, I'm not going to tell you. So it's a secret, right? But so much is revealed in that scenario there, Anna and Achilles, which is that this is almost parallel, of course, to Before Sunrise, the first film. Seems to be the same kind of night playing out between these two young lovers, which is very similar to Before Sunrise and Celine and Jesse, the summer of '94, except that, and also it's very similar also because the idea of stretching out of time and the out of whackness of time, if you will, right? He whispers something, and a few seconds later she hears it. So that seems to be almost an unnatural feeling of time and place, which is, I think, very much in the same spirit of Before Sunrise, right? They were not in real time, right? They were in a special zone of time. It was Cinderella, and before everything had to turn back to pumpkins. That's what they said in the film. But this is also different than the way that Before Sunrise turned out, right? Because the fact that they are together. They met last year, and then they had to go off in their separate ways. But they are now back together, which is different than what happened with Celine and Jesse at the end of Before Sunrise, right? They were supposed to meet 6 months later, but they didn't, and we know why. But why is this different for Anna and Achilles? Skype, right? They kept in touch via Skype, right? Which is a key difference to what they agreed in Before Sunrise. Of course, Skype didn't exist at that time, I think, but so they couldn't do that. Of course, they could exchange telephone numbers or something like that, or addresses, but they didn't. They made a pact. They agreed not to because they understood that they would meet 6 months later, but that didn't happen. But that is a very interesting thing. Modern romance, I think, is what the follow-up of Celine in that moment. But this is interesting, too. It goes to the question of, had Jesse and Celine just exchanged phone numbers, if they just exchanged addresses, their lives could have been very different. And I think that possibility of their lives being very different is actually being played out, therefore, by the presence of Anna and Achilles and the story of how they got together. But what is interesting about this is that, do you know what Anna says later? She says in a later part of the scene, she says, I understand, or I expect that we will break up. She has a very almost cynical, but maybe realistic view of her relationship with Achilles. And Achilles also said, if it weren't for money, then I think my parents would have divorced or something like that. So these young lovers have a very almost pessimistic view, but almost a realistic view about relationships and how relationships may not last. And this is derived from the part of the scene where Anna is talking about her great-grandmother and how she died, and just before she died, she wrote this long letter addressed to her family, and it was like a 20-some-odd page letter, and 3 pages were devoted to a dress that she made as a seamstress, but only 1 paragraph was devoted to her husband, right? And so, what is it? The idea is that this leads to the conversation about how there isn't this idea of soulmates, but rather the letter is suggesting that friendships are better, and friendships are what makes things worthwhile, not this idea of a soulmate. And that concept of a soulmate doesn't exist. Well, my goodness, that is also, I think, something that is maybe running parallel with or maybe running contradictory against what we saw in Before Sunset. It's up to your interpretation, of course. But the point is that this scenario that Anna and Achilles, the young couple, are presenting seems to be, on the one hand, similar to but also very different from the Celine and Jesse scenario that we saw in Before Sunrise. So their existence or their presence at this table is very, very important. So I that's what I think about that. Then we go to the Ariadne and Stefanos characters. And so their situation is that they seem to be maybe the same age, maybe a little bit older. They seem also to have kids as well. Stefanos is very much talkative about sex. He seems to be talking a lot about other women and that sort of thing, and he talks about pornography, virtual porn, and that sort of thing, and Ariadne seems to be joking, but also they have an argument and they call it negotiation at one point, and they seem to have a very good relationship, even though there is the suggestion that maybe their relationship wasn't always so rosy, and maybe there were some incidents or maybe some events along the way that might be suggested by the sort of lascivious nature, if you will, of Stefanos. And so this is another possible scenario that can be related to the relationship between Jesse and Celine. If we think of Jesse and Celine dealing with their arguments, remember when I said that Ariadne and Stefanos described their arguments as negotiation. Remember how surprised Celine is when she's in the kitchen and she's trying to make the, stuffing the tomatoes, and don't overstuff them. And Stefanos says, "You're doing such a good job." And Ariadne says, "Oh no, this is the first time you're cooking this." And this leads to a kind of playful argument. She's carrying a knife, etc. But then she describes their fighting as not fighting, but negotiation. And Celine is actually kind of surprised by this. This idea of negotiation, of course, is very different than the idea of fighting, right? Warfare. And if you think of their fight as being a kind of battle, then battle is not the same as negotiation. And so that is an alternative to the relationship that the relationship between couples. And so for Celine and Jesse, at least as it transpires at the end of this film, it turns into a huge fight. Whereas with Ariadne and Stefanos, maybe they had their fights already, and now they have mellowed and they know each other to the point that they have a workable, loving relationship. And also remember, Ariadne says also that she doesn't believe in true love, and she set her expectations low with Stefanos. But I think there is a sense of realization that the concept of a true love or soulmate maybe isn't the point, but once that has been abandoned, then life can be enjoyed. And I think this is further emphasized by Patrick, the older man, the writer here, and how he says that he's married, but his wife takes care of herself and he takes care of himself, and they meet in between. And what does he say? Let's see. We are not one person; we are two people. And Patrick said, "It's not the love of one other person that matters; it is the love of life that matters." And so he turns it to the idea of love of life rather than the reliance of love, right? Loving someone else. And I think this is also an alternative to the philosophies of Celine and Jesse, and in particular Celine. Remember, Celine in the earlier films has always expressed the idea that she, on the one hand, she doesn't want to be relying on a man, but at the same time, she values the idea of loving and being loved. She wants this. She said it. She said as much in both films, in fact. And so, the earlier films, Before Sunrise and Before Sunset, she wants to be loved. She wants to love and be loved. And so, this is something that might seem to be a little bit contradictory to what Patrick is saying. But on the other hand, Patrick is also voicing a kind of kindred spirit, if you will, with the first two films, in that if we think of the first two films as being the affirmation of life, that is important. Not necessarily the idea of love, but the affirmation of life. Then what he's saying now, what's important, the love of life, then that is absolutely consistent with the first two films. And so it's your call how you want to read what his role is in the film vis-a-vis Celine and Jesse. Is he really so different from them, or maybe he is more closely similar to them than they might themselves realize? Who knows? But it does present a kind of alternate reality. Again, he is older, so maybe we can possibly imagine the scenario that maybe they might grow up, Celine and Jesse might grow older in a way that is similar to what we see Patrick and his situation. And also we have to bring in his friend Natalia, right? And Natalia's story is very interesting because, again, her husband Elias is now deceased, and so she has this story about how she still remembers him. Right? She still remembers him, and she remembers the way that he was whistling, walking at night or down the street, and she would always find herself thinking about what he might say in a particular situation. And now she's saying that she is starting to forget him unintentionally, and he is fading, and like she is losing him again, and so she tries to make the conscious effort to remember him. And so she can almost touch him, but then he disappears in the sunlight. And she says something very profound. She says, the sun somehow makes him disappear, like a sunrise or a sunset or anything so ephemeral, just like our life. We appear and we disappear, and we are so important to some, but we are just passing through. And then they all say, they make a toast to passing through. And this is very significant, right? For one thing, she mentions the words sunrise and sunset, ephemeral, right? The links to the titles, I think, is very obvious. She's also talking about the details, the richness of the details. She can see his face, the color of his eyes and his lips, his teeth, the texture of his skin. This reminds me so much of Celine, how she was, when she was younger, she loved the details of the people that she was with, those little things. And she even says so much in the, when she meets Jesse again in Before Sunset. She loved the little details of a man that she would be with, which is why every time she broke up, it would be such a difficult thing for her. Whereas for the man, it would be easy. It would be like switching breakfast cereals. I think that's how she put it. But it would be the little details that she, of course, loved. And so I would like to think that Natalia in this dinner scene is almost like Celine. This almost feels like the younger Celine that we saw in the first two films, now grown up. But she is like this. Why? She is thinking about this. Why? Because now her Elias is now gone. And so this is a very interesting, the idea of absence and how this heightens one's romantic feelings, I think is something very interesting. Jesse and Celine are together, which might be reason for the fact that there is a little bit of disenchantment in the relationship, at least how Celine sees it. And so maybe the fact that they're together means that Celine doesn't have these feelings anymore. Whereas when they weren't together in Before Sunrise, and when they were just meeting, in Before Sunset, and when they were just meeting in the first film, Before Sunrise, she still had these feelings, these romantic feelings. And remember in Before Sunrise too, related to this, when she's talking about her grandmother and how she had just learned that her grandmother told her that her grandmother had been in love with another person throughout her life, and she just kept those feelings deep down within herself. And so it was like what is it? The idea that the grandmother too had this love that wasn't there, but it was still a kind of a romantic inclination, if you will. I think that's how Jesse put it. But the point is that there seems to be this kind of romanticism, or romantic ideas, or romantic inclinations that seem to arise in the absence of the other person. And I think this therefore creates another alternative universe or possibility, this time I think more directly for Celine. This is the Celine that we once knew, but is no longer there because, paradoxically, ironically, she is now with Jesse. And so this might be the younger Celine grown up, not having been with Jesse, but maybe recalling the night that she had had with Jesse. I love to think that that is a possibility. And so Natalia reminds me of that possibility. And so the point that I wanted to bring is that this whole scene is very significant because we are seeing alternate realities actually play out before our very eyes in real time and before Jesse and Celine's eyes themselves. And so this, I think, furthers the hypothesis or hypothetical interpretive reading that I was trying to suggest earlier, namely that this series of films is another way to look at them is seeing them as parallel universes and the possibilities. And when one possibility is taken and chosen, the other possibilities fold up before us and they become no longer possible. And it's sometimes the characters, Celine and Jesse, in many ways, how they are trying to defy those possibilities and how they're trying to fight against them. At least we saw that a lot in Before Sunset. Here, maybe they are resigned to their fates. Maybe they are just struggling to deal with the ramifications and consequences of their choices, which I think is a very a different proposition than what we saw in the earlier two films, but still equally as important and equally as artistically significant and ultimately very satisfying, I think. So, to passing through. So, but let me now go to the chat because I think you have so many things, great things to say. But let's see. Oh, Vanessa's here. Hello. I hope that did you manage to see the films? I know you just got the set a few weeks ago. I hope you did. I'd love to hear your thoughts, my friend. Let's see. Raymond says, glad to see Celine talk to Hank and the love she has for him and that she loves him like he is her own son. Yes, and there are moments when she also expresses a little bit of sort of motherly irritation towards Jesse and also towards Hank, right? There's a point in the fight where she says, I'm the one who has to clean off the toilet seat. Jesse and Hank's sort of toilet splash. I don't know if you want to call it that. So she's the one who has to clean that off. So she implicates not just Jesse but also Hank in that. So that's an interesting. I consider that to be a kind of motherly sort of irritation. But that's consistent with what you're saying, Raymond, I think. Justin Bliss is here. Hello, my first live stream of yours. Watched the movie last night and I liked it. However, I prefer the first two movies. A very legitimate reading, my friend. And thank you for joining. I really appreciate it, Justin. I hope you're well. Robbie Racine says, I watched all three of these in one day. It was a beautiful thing. Wow. Let's see. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here. Let's see. Jared is here. Hello. It's nice to see you, my friend. To me, this is my favorite of the trilogy. Just how everything turns out seems very real. Real, I like that word. And I enjoyed seeing how things came after being together for so long. It was really great. I also liked how we see Henry in this film, Hank, the young boy, while we only heard about him in the first film, as well as seeing their daughters, yes. Regarding a potential fourth film, you say, because I'm completely late with all this, Ethan Hawke has wanted one for some time, and Linklater has expressed interest in one as an epilogue in the last few years. That's a very interesting concept. I could see it going for one more, maybe two. I'm not sure. I know it's not. I know it's not at all scientific, but I always like to think. That scene in Before Midnight when they're looking at the sunset. And it's going down, and it's of course very metaphorical about their relationship, and it's Celine saying, "Still there, still there, still there, still there, gone." Right? And how many times does she say this? She says, let's see here. Here goes. She says, "Still there" 4 times. So still there, still there, still there, still there, gone. And so I know it's not scientific, but I always would love to have thought that, the number of still there's would be the 4 films. So before sunrise, before sunset, before midnight, and then the 4th film, and then gone. Maybe that's the epilogue. I'm not sure, but I was in my heart of hearts, I always thought that would be a lovely thing. I do think that there will be there will be a fourth film. But again, it's not clear to me whether they will be together or whether they will be separated, but still maybe come together for one last film or an epilogue, as you suggest. And but let's go into why I think the possibility is that they might not be together. And to do this, I can just discuss the rest of the film, including the fight scene. But so from here, right, they go on their walk from the house to the hotel because Ariadne and Stefanos has arranged the hotel. So this is a very supposed to be their night. But Celine, early on in the film, seems to have been expressing, seems to have been expressing a little bit of reluctance to want to go to the hotel, right? She says early on, I don't want to go, but she's interrupted by the telephone call in the car, remember? And then she tries to essentially maneuver Jesse into asking Ariadne and Stefanos to say, maybe can we cancel the hotel? And then, but they refuse to accept the cancellation, and so they're going to the hotel. So this is the first time that we see well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. So they walked from the house to the hotel, and this is now the signature walk and talk that we have known and loved from the earlier films. And it's wonderful to see this dynamic again. We hear ideas about Jesse's stories. We get this notion of memory, and we are living in a dream, which is what I was referring to earlier. And there's a little bit of let's see, excuse me here. Let's see. Sorry about this. Oh, there's the idea of men wanting to compare themselves with other men and women not feeling the need to do that, which I mentioned earlier, this idea of the male point of view and the female point of view. There's also the idea of the children not being there. And this is one of the first times in a long time that they're really alone. Now, this is very significant too, because what this is sort of echoed in the earlier scene with the people at the dinner or the late lunch, whatever it is, but the feast. And Celine and Jesse have a little bit of an argument in front of everyone, a kind of a passive aggressive argument, but an argument nonetheless. And before that, Celine describes how kind of cynical terms, how the first time they had sex without a condom, they had twins, and she was chained to the sink ever since. I think that's her phrase. And so there is this interesting parallel that is occurring with the earlier two films, and I include Before Sunrise in that there is this implication. It's not outwardly expressed, but there's an implication, well, actually might be outwardly expressed, that while, of course, Celine expresses love and devotion to her children, and there's no indication that suggests at all that she is an unfit mother or anything like that. Don't get me wrong, but she does express moments of frustration and not knowing what to do. One of the things that is mentioned in the fight, remember, is that one of the things that was really frustrating for her was that she couldn't express to Jesse her feelings of not knowing and her feelings of confusion about motherhood while he was out doing book tours and everything. So she had to deal with all this by herself, and she had to take the stroller down the stairs and walk the kids at night for hours just to get them to go to sleep. And she had to do this. She had to burden this all on her own while Jesse was essentially enjoying life. And so we understand that motherhood hasn't always been easy for Celine, at least how she expresses it. And even in this brief glimpse in the feast, she describes it kind of in joking terms, yes, but how she was chained to the sink after she realized that she was pregnant, and she had children. And so these actually bring up a lot of parallels with the earlier films. If you recall, for example, Jesse in the first film talks about his parents and how they divorced, and how there was this moment where he heard his father accidentally say, Jesse was an accident. That was the implication. And I know she doesn't say it in those terms, but the way that she describes it, kind of in the feast as a joke, is almost similar to this idea of the twins were an accident, maybe a happy accident, but still an accident all the same, and so a not planned pregnancy, and so that has certain echoes with Jesse and how he describes himself in the first film. Then let's recall what Jesse describes his marriage to be in the second film when they're on the boat talking about his marriage and how it's like I'm now running a nursery with her, and that this is, and all the time of and Celine follows up and she says, I have a friend who's a shrink, and she says, a lot of couples go through this, and that when they have children, all the time goes to the children, and that's understandable, and that men have to feel like they are the providers and some things like that, and so she uses the word providers, but the idea is that when children are born, that seems to have an effect on the relationship between the couple. And I think understandably so. It's the evolution of the relationship. Whether it's good or bad, I mean, that's a different question entirely. But the point is that time devotion naturally shifts to the children, as it should, right? As it should with any family. But what happens is that the love between the couple seems to be affected, and I think this is reflected in both instances, but in rather poignantly in these episodes that we hear in Before Sunset. The way that Jesse describes his marriage on the boat in Before Sunset sounds almost eerily familiar to the way that his marriage seems to be as with the birth of their twin daughters. And now they have no time except with their daughters, etc., especially Celine. That parallel seems to be very, very close to me, such that one can draw an extended conclusion, reasonable conclusion, that because of that situation, and the fact that not Ethan Hawke, but Jesse and his wife split up, maybe the fact that Celine and Jesse are in a similar type of situation with children, maybe the same fate will happen with the two of them. Maybe they will split up as well. Who knows? But it is possible that that could happen, especially with these films. These films are very much into parallels and echoes and seeing things turned in a different direction in the following film. So it is very possible. It is, of course, possible they still stay together, of course. But what was I saying? Yes, so this idea of children also is very important and key. And Celine says as much during the fight, if you recall, the idea of how taking care of the kids took a lot from her, not just in terms of not knowing what to do and Jesse not being there, but also just the responsibilities of motherhood are quite significant. And so she's expressing that, I think, very vocally and very reasonably during the fight. And this is an area where I don't think Jesse responds that well. I think he says at one point, "You did a great job," which I think is very almost condescending in a way, because it doesn't acknowledge the fact that, well, it does tacitly acknowledge the fact that he wasn't there, although in other parts of the fight he's also trying to suggest that, I picked the kids up from school and that sort of thing. So, but is that enough? Does he really know, for instance, the name of the pediatrician? He does during the walk say that time is demarcated, and he does remember events in his past life by the events of his children, and so he remembers when what happened in what was it? He remembers that point. What was it? August 2009. And she quizzes him. He says, "What happened then?" "Oh yeah, we were on vacation with your parents, and the kids came down with chicken pox." And so there is a kind of interesting dynamic going on. And what I think is happening here is something similar that we see with the introduction of the Hank character to the proceedings in the first part of the film, namely that the children seem to become an integral part of the relationship. So it's not it's not just Celine and Jesse anymore, but Celine and Jesse and the children, the twins, and also Celine and Jesse and Hank. And so therefore, I'd like to think also of the possibility that if we do get a fourth film, they might still be together. That is still a possibility. Or they might be apart. That is also a possibility. But the children will be grown up. And I think the fact that the children play such an important factor in their relationships now will mean that we will need to see their children grown up in the next film, if ever that were to happen. Because, as I say, and also it's going back to Celine's line during the fight, our lives are sort of messed up through our parents, and so it seems like not just we're talking about the lives in between couples, Celine and Jesse as an example, but we're also talking about the generational, which is the moments or the lives and relationships and connections between the generations. And so in this film, for the first time in the series, in this trilogy, we do see this manifest, right? We don't necessarily we hear inklings of it in the earlier films. Jesse talking about his parents, Celine talking about her grandmother in particular, and her parents as well. But here there's a real sense of connection and how deep rooted it seems to affect Jesse and Celine's relationship, right? The twins and motherhood having affected Celine. And she says at one point in the fight, she still hasn't recovered, which I think is very significant, right? And then for Jesse, the idea is Hank. And the idea is that he is missing out on these years of his life when Hank is going to become a freshman in high school. And then 4 years from now, he'll be on his own, as he says, which is, of course, completely the opposite of what he says in the car ride in Before Sunset, right? When he's describing how Hank is the best thing and how he wants to spend every day of his life with him. Didn't quite turn out that way, was what we find out in Before Midnight. But in any event, Hank has a very big influence on Jesse and therefore on the relationship between Celine and Jesse, just as the twins have a very big influence on Celine and therefore the relationship between Celine and Jesse, and also on Jesse as well. So this is very important, the role of the children and the way in which they have affected their relationship. And but now they are going to be together, alone they're going to be alone, and so this is the hotel night, and so the walk. There's a lot here, but I'll try to get to the highlights. So some of the highlights of the walk, which I want to draw your attention to, are just recall how Jesse, kind of in jest but kind of not, makes reference to maybe how Celine might have been having maybe brief sexual encounters with leaders of the Eastern Bloc, I think, and there's reference made to Gorbachev, and and Celine actually takes offense at this and says, "You take that back, take that back. It didn't happen. Take that back." And so this is a little bit reminiscent, if you recall, of Before Sunset, when they're in the cafe, and also a little bit beyond. They're having jokes about how she's a communist or that sort of thing, and she was a little bit offended by this, but she kind of went along. In Before Sunset, remember when she's talking about in Before Sunset how she visited Warsaw, and then later, Jesse says that, oh, commie, and then she says, oh, I'm not a commie, no, and then she goes along with the joke, and she says, I'll send you to a gulag or something, and it's a little bit of a joke, right? And then later, she says, "Oh, my cat's name is Che." Oh, Che, commie. No, Che, right? So she explains the meaning of what Che means in Argentinian. But here she doesn't go along with the joke, right? She went along with the joke about sort of politics and communism in the second film, but not in the third film. So this is a kind of an indication that she is maybe in a different place than where she was in the second film. She's not willing to make these same jokes or similar types of jokes that she did in the earlier film. So that seems to be significant. And the other significant thing is they're talking about the death of the grandmother, Jesse's grandmother, and how the grandmother and also the deceased grandfather were together. And they were together for a very long time, and they calculate that the number of years that Jesse and Celine would be together in the same number of years would be 56 years. And so they talk about, would they still be together for 56 years? And would you be able to put up with me for 56 years? What changes would you want me to make in 56 years? That sort of thing. And so this brings to mind the idea, not just the idea of being together and time, but also death, because they also bring in the idea of who will outlive the other. And so therefore this, I think, brings in the possibility that death will be a more prominent theme in any future films in the series, because they are getting older, and this is a natural progression in life. You know, the idea of impending death, and so and death has been a preoccupation of the characters, especially Celine, in throughout the entire series. And so I think this is a natural course, and so we will see how death, the theme of death, plays itself out in later films if we ever get them. And also, another significant thing about the walk is they enter a church. Remember that? Which is a little shrine. It's a shrine to Saint Odilia, patron saint of eyesight. And this is very interesting too, because this goes into the impermanence of things, about how the monks would paint on hot, or they would use water and draw on hot rock, which would evaporate. So it's sort of suggestive of the impermanence of things. Blindness and sight. This is also a key theme in the film, and it's tied in particular with Celine, because Celine, Jessie says at the end, you know, if you don't see this, you are blind. If you don't see this as love, you are blind. And this also has a lot of resonance with the earlier films, and in particular with before sunset. I'm sorry, before sunrise, the first film, because of the fortune teller. And the fortune teller actually is a very significant scene in that film, and that resonates throughout the entire series. But the fortune teller, remember in the first film, she says to Celine as she's reading her palm, she says, "You need to resign yourself to the awkwardness of life. When you find peace with yourself, then will you find true connection with others." And it's interesting too, in the same scene in the first film, she's the fortune teller asks, about Jessie, who is he? And Celine describes him, he's the fortune teller says, "Oh, is this a stranger to you?" And Celine sort of goes along with the joke and says, "Oh, I guess so," acknowledging that he's kind of a stranger. Well, in this film, before midnight, at the very end, when they're at the table at night, she says to him after they had their fight, "I don't talk to strangers." And so the word stranger is echoed. Again, another throwaway line, but I think it's a beautiful echo nonetheless. But the point is the fortune teller, and that she is saying to Celine at this early state, you need to resign yourself to the awkwardness of life, and only when you find peace within yourself will you find true connection with others. And so this seems to be relatively similar to the idea of you have to see what this is. If you don't see it, you're blind. And I think it's no coincidence, therefore, that they are stopping by the shrine to the patron saint of sight. And so and this is in the kind of a sacred ground, and she's making jokes, sexual jokes, which makes Jessie a little bit uncomfortable, of course. But also the idea is an interesting thing. They make reference to like Quakers. Remember, you're a Quaker, and this is also, I think, reference to the fact that, remember, in the first film in Vienna, they were in a church and they were talking about a Quaker wedding, and about how the Quaker wedding was that the bride and the groom, they stand before the congregation, and when they feel the inspiration of God, then they will talk to each other, and that's when they are married. So that's the Quaker wedding, at least as Jessie describes it. And it's interesting how they mention Quaker here. Celine says, "You Quaker." And what is it? Jessie, so like the girls asked them what was their wedding like, and Celine says, "Oh, I told the girls that it was low key." And then Jessie says, so low key I don't remember." And she says, "Very Quaker," right? So that's a nice little reference to there. So yeah, that's also a confirmation, therefore, that they are indeed married, right? Because right, what was our wedding like? That's what she says. So. But this idea of sight and eyesight and being able to see and being blind, I think this is very significant, and it'll play out throughout the film, and it's actually been played out in the previous films already. So this is, again, I have to sort of speed it along because I realize I'm almost at 2 a.m. and I haven't even gotten to the fight for the most part. So let's go to the fight. And let's see here what it is that we have in the hotel room. This is one of the most significant scenes in the entire series of films. One, because this is a bona fide fight between them, and it goes in many different places. And this is the first time we see this kind of volatile, out-and-out fight. We have seen instances where they do have disagreements in other films, but this is a real fight. And it threatens the very foundation of the relationship, to the point where she says at the very end, right, I don't think I love you anymore, right? That is a big deal. That is a very big deal. And so, but we also have to remember how it starts. It starts as a kind of, right, it starts as they have like a couples massage and a bottle of wine, and they also initiate sort of sexual foreplay. And so we've never seen this real. We've seen kissing, and we've seen embracing in the first film in particular, but we always cut, right? We didn't see any sex scene in that film. Well, here we see the beginnings of a kind of sex scene between Celine and Jesse, and nudity as well. So this is a very, very intimate moment. One of, I would say, probably one of the most intimate moments, or the most intimate moment between them, sexually anyway. Again, even in Before Sunset, we can assume that after the screen fades to black, they probably got together, maybe by the end of the Nina Simone song, right? But we never saw it, right? Because we left them. We left their world before we could see what actually happened. Well, here we are with them, at least during the initial stages of their sexual foreplay, and so. This is something that we haven't seen, and this is very interesting too. But even during this moment of intimacy, we see two clues that indicate that maybe Celine, her love of Jesse is kind of cooled even before the fight has taken place. So two things that she says are very interesting, which is almost sort of like passive-aggressive rejections of Jesse. So the first is, as they're embracing, what does she say? She says, you know, that the red in your beard is gone. Right, and she later says, "I see that in the kids. What does she say? In the kids. What does she say? Well, she says, I never noticed until today, but all the red in your beard is gone. It used to be one of the things that made me fall for you. And I see the red in our girls' eyelashes, and I look at them, and it makes me remember about when we first met." This is very significant. Do you remember from Before Sunset? That's the little thing that she mentions on the boat. You know, I remember the little red, and how the sunshine would make it glow. And that was one of the things that I really loved about you. And that's what she says on the boat. And that has so many implications, right? She mentions the little red in Before Sunset. She mentions the sunshine, how it hit. This recalls also Natalia's story earlier in the film in Before Midnight about how Elias, and how whenever she tried to remember him, he would be gone at the moment of sunshine. And I think there's an ironic connection, therefore, that sunshine illuminates something that we love about a partner, but also it dashes it and destroys it. And here, Natalia's discussion of the sunshine, it seems sort of eerily foreboding of the fact that here now, later in the film, Celine says, I never noticed until now, but the red in your beard is gone. Right? And that is a clue that maybe her love for him is gone. It has transferred over to a love and devotion for her kids. That's one thing. The second thing is when they're in bed, and he says, in a way of try to connect with her, you know, I remember listening to your eyelids open and close, and I remember I could hear you think, and your mind going 2 million miles an hour, and just that was kind of a compliment. But what does she say in response? She says, "Oh, when you used to say to me that you could hear me think, I really thought that you could. But if it was just my eyelids, how dumb and romantic of me. I miss thinking too," she says. "No more thinking in the morning, no more morning sex. I'm looking forward to it so much." So she expresses looking forward to this moment, but at the same time, she's saying also, oh gosh, I was dumb to think that you really could hear me think when it was in fact just my eyelids opening and closing, that noise. And that is also this idea of reality crashing down. It's like a fantasy that she had, but it really was a reality of it was just the noise of her eyes. Again, it was like the idea of Cleopatra the cat, the fantasy or the notion that she had, but the reality was very different. Here it's a similar sort of thing as a kind of rejection, if you will, of reality that she's expressing. And especially in this context, when we realize that the fight will lead to her ultimate expression of, I don't love you anymore. And what is this fight about, right? This fight comes about after the call from Hank that interrupts their foreplay. And we see a moment after the call is finished, we see a moment where Celine removes her panties. And it's a very subtle moment, but that also reminds me, that's a very intimate moment. But we also have to remember that we have to look at the timing of when she puts her dress back on and when she puts her panties back on, because this is the moment where she is really just getting ready for being ultimately intimate, physically intimate with Jesse. But when she puts her clothes back on, this is the timing of when her intimacy is being closed off. And these are subtle hints, but these are things that we have to spot, the timing of these things when we see them fight. The same thing too when she's making tea. These moments are almost upending our notions of Celine and Jesse that we saw in the earlier films. Remember when she made tea in Before Sunset in her apartment? And that was a moment when Jesse was also sitting on the couch, and it was a moment of ultimate romance. Well, here she's making tea, but is it romance? Far from it. It is the height of their fight and argument. And the argument is stemming from she doesn't want to go to Chicago, and Jesse doesn't want to leave Hank. And so what are they going to do? And that is the struggle that they have. That is the core struggle, at least as it's expressed in this fight. But as I suggest, maybe the seeds of the fight happened earlier in the film, and maybe they happened prior to the film, and maybe they happened earlier in the earlier two films. And so just when you watch the other two films again, play close attention to where you think the seeds might be sown for the argument that we have here. And so we get things that are, as I say, upending what we've seen in the earlier films, but also paralleling what we've seen in the earlier films. So an example of upending is the idea of the tea. She's making tea in a kind of a way that is in the midst of an aggressive fight, which is very different from Before Sunset. But also a parallel is the notion of the use of English and languages. We saw it in the earlier films, how Celine has this way of using English. Her English is really great, but once in a while, her English is grammatically incorrect. And sometimes Jesse will correct it, sometimes he won't. There are 2 points in the fight where actually I think her English is grammatically incorrect. She says at one point, you Americans, you tend to take problems and you swipe them under the rug. I think the expression is sweep them under the rug. I'm not sure, but the other sort of error is when she says she uses the object of the preposition incorrectly, and she says something and I, and then Jesse says me instead of I, because that's the prepositional object. It's not meant to be I, it's meant to be me. But I think that is hold on, let me just try to find that exactly right. Excuse me here. Let's see. Sorry about this. Give me 1 second. Oh, yes. So she says, Celine says, which she's referring to Hank, and she says, Hank knows how bad it is between his mother and I. And then Jesse says, it's mother and me, right? And so he kind of meanly corrects her. He didn't need to. But I remember when they're in the park in Before Sunrise, the first film, when he is talking about his parents in the park, he actually refers to his sister and I. And he says, it's yes, he says about his parents. They stuck together for the well-being of my sister and I, and that's what he says in Before Sunrise. And so it's interesting how I think that's incorrect in terms of the use of the prepositional object. It should have been they stuck together for the well-being of my sister and me, I think, and because of is a preposition. Well, here he corrects Celine, but we recall that he made a similar grammatical error when he was younger, 18 years prior. And so I think there's a little bit of irony there. I don't know if it was meant to be that case, but I think there's a little bit of irony there. But it is meant, I think, to recall the idea of use of English. And sometimes Celine's use of English will be corrected and sometimes it won't. Remember earlier in the earlier films, the way she used the word media, she would say like the media as in news, but she'd say medias instead of media. And sometimes I think Jesse would correct her. He corrected her in the first film, but he didn't correct her in the second film. But that's something that comes up. And so this plays out in a number of different scenarios in the fight. And right, the idea of Celine not being comfortable in the role of the nurturer, not being comfortable to the point where she doesn't even like the word nurturer. And the idea also that Jesse is expressing how he really effed up. And what does that mean, effed up? Did he F up by the fact that he moved to Paris with Celine? What does that mean? I think he meant to say he effed up by the fact that they didn't meet 6 months from summer of '94 when they planned to in Vienna. And I think that was what he meant to say. But Celine seems to interpret it to say he gave up everything for her to go to Paris to live with her. So therefore, he effed up his life by moving to Paris with her. And therefore, she interprets that to mean that he blames her for what happens to his life, where she is trying to say to him, no, it's your responsibility. This is what you did. Don't blame it on me. It's very significant, though, because Jesse says this, I effed up, many times throughout this fight. And she says, I effed up my life. I effed up because of your music. And he is also very demeaning when maybe he's not meaning to be, but at one point when Celine is saying, I wanted to write more music. You remember how I was writing songs? I really wanted to do more of that, but I couldn't. And he says, well, my writing isn't a hobby, right? Which is very demeaning. And also she's trying to manipulate him also by saying she's sort of trying to be one step ahead of him, and she's almost kind of anticipating what it is that he might say. And so she is really attacking him, but he is also attacking her as well. So I think it's a sort of a mutual fight. One might see maybe Jesse being a little bit more calmer perhaps, but really he is playing a lot of manipulative tricks just as much as Celine is, I think. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I don't mean to have a negative connotation. I mean, it's very natural as a human inclination to use manipulative tricks. I mean, that is very in conflict with other people, right? But still, he says, I am the unemotional, rational one, which Celine interprets as being an implicit acknowledgement that I am right and you are wrong. And so that's then she takes it a little bit too far and says, men in history have made terrible decisions by being unemotional and rational. And then she makes reference all the way up to the final solution, which I think is actually overstepping it quite a bit. But so my point is that the fight is sort of ebbs and flows, where each has his or her own moment to really try to attack the other, but sometimes they go too far in one direction or the other direction. And so it becomes this back and forth of a real volatile type of situation. And it comes down to who will make the compromise, who will move, right? And there's one point where Celine actually expresses a rational compromise. She says, ask me 1 month later. Right now I'm not in the mood, but ask me 1 month later and I'll see what I'll say. So I think that is a real positive thing for Celine. And so I actually consider that to be a very sort of good step. But unfortunately, what happens is that, let's see here. Yeah, what happens is that afterwards, Jesse sort of calms down, but then he says again, I just effed it all up. And then Celine tries to interpret that and says, what do you mean? And that causes her to be agitated again, and that causes the fight to start up again. And then she leaves, and then she comes back, and then she says, you think you're winning. It's very difficult to have a child. To be a woman. And she says, my secret fear was that all the men that I was with wanted to turn me into a submissive housewife. And this is very different also from the way that she was describing the men in her life in Before Sunset. Do you remember the second film in the car? And she says, all the men that I've been with, they leave me and they get married. Why didn't they ask me? I would have said no, but still I wanted them to ask me. So in one way, in the earlier film, she was almost kind of expressing a kind of wish to want to be married. But then here she's saying a secret fear was that they would make me be, and the difference is submissive housewife. And that's the difference, the word submissive. And I think that is the key to understanding, or trying to understand, where Celine is at this particular moment in the film. She doesn't want to be submissive. She doesn't want to go to Chicago and what does she say? Match the color of the drapes with the furniture or something like that. And she doesn't want to lose the opportunity to take this job with Remy and the government and really build her ambition, which is something that she lost. She wants to have more time. She wants to doesn't want to lose her dreams. She wants to write more songs, and she doesn't have the ability to do that. And so but then the fight then goes into another calm section, and then they talk about motherhood and the strains of motherhood, and then Jesse says a kind of maybe tacitly condescending thing where he says, you did a good job, rather than try to be more understanding and more maybe express maybe a little bit of being sorry for not being there, but that's okay for the moment. And then he opens the wine too, and they're about to drink the wine, but then they talk about conflict, and the conflict in the daughters, and the fight and the hula hoop, and that leads to the conversation about how you are no Henry Miller. I know your routine in terms of sexual foreplay and being in bed, and I know it, and it's boring, and it's really simple, and it's pathetic. And this recalls, if you recall, the Before Sunset sequence in the park when they're sitting down on the bench, and how talking about one of her friends, and how they want to know the sexual desires. Kind of sexual foreplay, what are the words that turn them on, and that sort of thing. And that kind of information is to try to get to know one's sexual partner. Where here in Before Midnight, the information about what one's sexual partner likes, here it's Jesse, is used against him in a very it almost feels out of nowhere, but it's at the point where they come to a disagreement about conflict. Jesse says conflict is negative, but Celine says conflict is positive, right? Because for Celine, conflict means fighting for what you believe in. And Jesse says negativity means there is a division in the unity of the human beings. And so that leads into the second arc of the argument, leading to not only humiliating or trying to humiliate him sexually, but also accusing him of infidelity. What does he say? Mr. Book Tour, Mr. Radisson Hilton, the reading in Washington. Swear on the kids that you didn't spend the night with that woman, Emily, right? It's so convenient that your cell phone was broken that night. And then what does Jesse do? He does what he has always done in the films. He doesn't give a direct answer. You notice this in many instances in the films, he never gives direct answers to very deep and personal questions. Whenever he's asked about his girlfriend in Madrid in Before Sunrise, he deflects. Whenever he is asked about, did you go to, was there a real Madeline? Is the book based on a real life incident? He deflects. Here, he's asked, did you sleep with another woman? He deflects. And so I think that deflection is an inherent, it could be seen, again, I'm not sure, but it could be reasonably interpreted to mean that, yes, he did. He had an affair, or he had an episode of infidelity. He slept with another woman that wasn't Celine. And if they're married, that means that he was unfaithful. And I think the deflection is interpreted by Celine, and I think reasonably so, to mean that yes, he did. Because what does he say? I am giving you my whole life. I'm not giving it to anyone else. What does that mean, right? If you didn't sleep with another woman, you'd say no, right? But if you did, you wouldn't say no. You would say something else. And I think that's what's happening here with Jessie. At least that's my interpretation. And so this is the moment where she does the thing about, Dostoevsky, and she's really mocking him right now. Oh, the Grand Commander is such the grand statement of Russian, literature, and she's mocking. This is the bimbo act that she put on before Patrick and everyone else earlier in the day. Oh, Romeo and Juliet. Romeo. Oh, that's a great book. And oh no, it's not a book. It's a play. He says, and actually that is echoed later in this fight when when she refers to Medea. And she says, oh, it's a Greek myth. And then Jesse, when he's going to the toilet, he says, actually, it's a play written by Euripides. So that parallel exists within the film itself. And so so we have to remember this sort of bimbo act that she puts on. We have to remember this because it comes back at the end of the film. But then he tries to throw back at her another accusation of infidelity with her ex-boyfriend, and then this leads to the final confrontation in the hotel room, which is, she says, the final proclamation. This is simple. I don't think I love you anymore, and boom, that's it. And we have a montage. This is very significant too, right? The montage is of the room, elements of the room, the bed, the wine glasses of wine that's not drunk. Remember, where else we saw wine glasses and wine? Right before sunrise in the park, it was a very different situation than we saw now. But here it is. It's undrunk, and it's after the end of a bitter, acrimonious fight between these two. And we see the montage of the place, right? We are just passing through. What did Natalia say? We are just passing through. And what were the montages that we saw in other films, right? We saw a montage at the end of the first film, right, to remind us that the characters, Jesse and Celine, they had their night, but they were just passing through, and the day moves on, and the environment is still there. And then the same is true at the start of Before Sunset. That is where we left off, but now we will begin afresh. Well, here, what happens? They have a fight, she leaves. We are with Jesse because he's still in the room, but what happens? We have montages to moments, parts of the room. This is the montage that we've seen in these past films, but here it's played out, I think, with a very different emotional resonance that is at the end, as I say, of this bitter, acrimonious battle. This is also very significant too, because this is also the first time that we see them break apart like this, but the camera stays with Jesse. It doesn't go with Celine, it stays with Jesse. And so this is also very significant. Some people have interpreted this to mean that maybe the filmmakers are maybe looking at the film or the story more through Jesse's eyes, but I think that's worth interpreting. But now let's go to the final scene and the end, right, which is very, very significant at the end of the table. And Celine is obviously very, very upset, but Jesse's making one last attempt. This is very significant too, because always we have seen in the films before, Jesse has been the one to initiate. He was the one to ask her he was the one who first talked to her at the train at the very beginning. He then asked her to get off the train with him and walk through Vienna. He initiated going on the ferry boat in Paris on the Seine. And now he is initiating this conversation again. So while there have been differences with the other films, there have also been similarities, and one of the similarities is Jesse doing the initiating. And isn't it what we said earlier in this live stream, which is that maybe with all these alternate realities and maybe with all these possible scenarios, things change, but people stay the same. Here, one can say that Jesse still is the same Jesse that we know, for good and for not so good. But here, maybe for good, because he is initiating the final attempt at a kind of, I don't know if détente is the right word, but a final attempt at peace between them. And what does he say first? I don't talk to strangers. Yes, I am that man that you, and that the man you knew back in the summer of '94. I'm that guy. And she says, I vaguely remember someone sweet and romantic, and it made me feel that I wasn't alone anymore. And then he goes into the time travel. Right, I've lived through this night, and I was just with your 82-year-old self, and I've come back from the future. And this is paralleling the time travel episode that we saw in Before Sunrise, the first film, and that was the way that he convinced her to get off the train with him. But maybe she was already convinced anyway. But that's what I think we can interpret that scene to mean. Here, the time travel is used in a similar way, but it's also different. It's similar in that he is trying to convince her to come back with him. And he's using humor, and he's using the letter, and he says, this is a letter from your 82-year-old self. And he reads off the letter. It's a napkin that he folded up in the first part of the conversation and clandestinely put it in his front pocket, and he pulled it out again for this final act. This, by the way, we've seen role-playing in other films before, right? We've seen role-playing in the first film when they're on the telephone and they're talking to their friends on the telephone. Here there's role-playing, but it's a different kind of role-playing. Unlike in the first film when they're both mutually, actively enjoying it. Here, you can tell Celine is not buying it, and she says, I don't want to play your games, which is very different from the Celine that we saw in that cafe in Vienna 18 years ago. But one thing that's very different about this time travel than the first film in the train, which is this idea of the letter, and this idea that this is a letter from your 82-year-old self, which we didn't necessarily see in the first film, right? We saw this idea of maybe this is your chance to fix something that maybe you got married and you weren't enjoying your marriage. So this is your chance to change it. So that's his hypothetical time travel pitch, right? Here, it's a little bit different. It's not a hypothetical time travel pitch. It's a fictionalized, yes, but it's a pitch which is based off of, this is a letter from yourself, 82 years old, addressed to you. And this is what it says, and it goes into the gist of it. And you're entering the best years of your lives. Your girls will grow up to become icons of feminism. The word icon of feminism was used in the first film, so that's a nice link. The best sex of my life happened one night in the southern Peloponnese. And this is great. And at this moment, the scene cuts to the final take. And it's the two of them sitting there. And this is one long take to the end of the film. And it's, again, what I mentioned at the beginning, the idea of the long take, the emphasis not on the joyousness of life, but on the reality of life. That's my suggestion here, which is an evolution of the long take usage that we saw from the first two films. From here on in, when he mentions this idea of P.S., the best sex of my life happened, this is the start of the one long take. And then Celine rejects this and says, I don't want to play your games. This is where Jesse says, right? Right. She says, did you hear me what I said back there? I don't love you. She says, right. And then he says, I'm trying to make you laugh. If you want true love, this is it. It's not perfect, but it's real. And if you can't see it, you're blind. A lot of things going on here. True love. Right? We saw the rejection of true love soulmates with the banquet, Patrick and the rest. Blindness, they visited the shrine to the patron saint of eyesight earlier in the film. And then reality. Reality is this idea of reality and love. Are they really mutually exclusive? That is one of the key questions that Celine asked herself in the earlier films. And here, it's the ultimate moment. Right? This is game time, as Jesse says earlier. And when it came time to it, I did it, right? But this is the moment where she has to make a decision. And the ball is in her court right now, right? Because he says, I give up. And he could have left it there. And in fact, the possibility, as expressed in the commentary track, I don't know if you heard it, was that they were actually thinking of Jesse leaving. That could have been possible way to end the film. But what happens? There's a moment of silence between them. They're looking at each other. She's looking down. This scene of them just silently looking, this is also beautifully reminiscent of the early film, the first film, when they're in the listening booth and they're listening to the song Come Here, and they're looking and they're not looking at each other and they're thinking the same thing and they're not like, that was a very romantic moment. A similar moment happened in the second film when they're walking up the stairs to Celine's apartment, and they're looking, and she's got the cat, and he's not looking this way and looking back, and they're looking and they're not looking, but it's another romantic moment. Here it's the same thing of looking and not looking, but it's a different whole emotional terrain entirely, because their whole relationship up to now hinges on this moment. And can they connect? Can they not connect? And oh my goodness, the parallels here that are drawn are just astounding. And it could have gone either way. And as the film ends, we don't know, because she asks about the time machine and she goes along with the joke. She doesn't laugh, but she goes, do I have to be naked, right? Clothes and the time travel are very difficult. And then she does the bimbo act. Space-time, wow, right? So this leads to an ambiguity as to whether they will be together or not. Is Celine really convinced that they really should be together or not? And it's not clear. What is clear is that something will happen that night. Maybe they will be together that night. Maybe they will end that night. I'm not sure. But whatever the case may be, how does she end it? She says, which is the last line in the film, "It must have been one hell of a night we're about to have." It must have been in the past. It must have been one hell of a night we're about to have. The past and the future we're about to have come together in one. And if that isn't a beautiful, grand statement about time and about existence and about the past and the present and the future all colliding together into one moment, then I don't know what is. And what does that leave for the future? I don't know. I think there are many possibilities. As we have seen expressed in the present tense of this film, there are always possibilities. There are different possibilities that can manifest themselves this way, that way. Did they meet? Did they not meet? Did they get together? Did they not get together? I don't know. But that means that the possibilities are endless. They could be together. They could not be together. Maybe they had the greatest night of their life and they are together, but maybe they're not. Who knows? Time will tell if we see another film. But in the meantime, it is wonderful to speculate, and it is also wonderful to revisit this film and also revisit the other two films in the context of this film. Therefore, I think that this film operates so well on its own, but a journey through the other two films, I think, is essential as I've tried to express it to you today in this live stream. But okay, so with that, I have to wrap it up because it is getting late, but let me go to the live chat and then we will call it a day. So let's see here. So let's see. Dennis A says there's also a playful argument in Before Sunset when they're having tea. Yes. Yes. Celine asked Jesse if he's turned Buddhist. Yes. So there's the tea. Yes. And I'm just going to scroll down here. Wolfgratz is here. Hello, my friend. I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling down the chat just in the interest of time. I really apologize. Okay. Jared Wignall says there's always a yin and a yang with the two of them. Just shows how realistic this film could be. Yes, and I love how you're using the word real and realistic. Very great stuff. Let's see. And, oops. Okay, there we go. And let's see. Oh, Raymond Rodriguez. Oh, great comments as always. Wonderful stuff. Let's see. You say at one point, Raymond, you say the film needs to move forward but only reflect on the past to remind us of things. But this would, Hank's future wife should be French, so it would reflect Jesse and Celine. Okay, so there's a little bit of speculation here about what the fourth film could be. That's very interesting. It's very interesting. And Gloin says, Gloin to Hobbit says, the fight in the hotel room cuts too deep and couples cannot rebound and continue a relationship. Yeah, it's very, it leaves room for doubt as to whether their relationship can really survive. But again, we'll have to wait and see. Let's see. Raymond says, Jesse has to remind Celine a lot of his love for her and how he always loves her and that she's the woman for him and that will never change. That's what he says, but again, how does he express that? Satisfactory to her or not? He's a writer and he knows how to talk, right? And maybe that talk is very important, but again, whether it works or not, time will tell. And so let's see. All right, and let's see. Again, I apologize for scrolling down so much, but I hope you can understand because let's see. Gloin to Hobbit says, sexual currency is deeply wired in our brains. Jesse in his 40s wants somebody younger, while Celine is insecure because she knows Jesse got future plans with another woman. That's interesting. There's actually an echo of that in the first film, Before Sunrise. She says, she would be jealous of him and the other women that he might be with. As she says that in the park in Vienna. And Jared says, I like how things end on a fairly optimistic note, that things can get better in the future for them. That's a good interpretation, and I think it's possible to interpret it many ways, actually. Is it optimistic? Maybe it's cynical and pessimistic. I don't know. I really don't know. The pessimism could come in by the fact that Celine does that act at the very end. Oh, you're so smart, that sort of thing, which could be a little bit demeaning. But it's also what she says also right earlier in the film. You play along, you let them win, you have to let the men win a little bit so that it's part of your end game. So maybe it's an indication of maybe she's letting him win this round, but maybe in the long term, it's she's not going to Chicago. Maybe that's the